I want to first say thank you to all of you. I'm very lucky to have this group. There are some bright spots in the pandemic, and for this one, it was that no one said no. So thank you. Let me start with a brief overview of what we've been up to. As an overarching idea, the studio is building on something that I've been especially interested in over the last few years. And that's the idea of interscalability, meaning we're testing the limits of sort of moving back and forth between multiple scales, often in really non-sequential ways, from detail to building, from site to detail, and back again in unusual orders. And the interest is in not just in repeating a primary detail over and over again at multiple scales, but in looking at ways of reinterpreting it as the scales, as that scale change sort of tests the limits of its direct application. The semester started out by looking at these puzzles. There's this company called Hanayama, a Japanese company that makes these really amazing little puzzles that kind of range from geometrically wondrous to excruciatingly frustrating. So each of them took one of these puzzles and they interpreted it in multiple ways and in different materials, different scales, sometimes 3D, sometimes 2D, and they really did this throughout the semester. One of the constant conversations in the studio was the idea of assembly. When you work on a building detail, the idea of assembly is a constant conversation, but rarely do you have a conversation about the role of assembly as you move to something like the relationship of a building to its site. Very few people have ever said, oh, I'm interested in the way that the building is assembled into the site. You also wouldn't typically look at a section and speak of it in terms of assembly. But the premise is essentially that it's precisely this kind of interlock, of complex assembly, and of spatial and formal complexity, programmatic adjacency that's unexpected, that often makes a building especially interesting. So I'll let the students build on that individually. The building is a 200,000 square foot art museum on a site that's currently a golf course, so it's a relatively large site. The site is, it's here in LA, it's directly across from the Greek Theater right along the edge of Griffith Park. On a little bit more of a personal note, if you've ever been to one of my reviews, you know that there's virtually no separation between the idea of making and the idea of thinking. And so this semester, as we transitioned over to making in different forms, it's been both incredibly challenging, but also super exciting to think about whether or not that way of thinking about materiality and assembly and things that typically take your hands that I once thought took your hands to think about, have to be thought about in different ways. The goal has been to keep all of those same issues in mind, but to work on them in different ways. So for the people watching from YouTube, I want to give a kind of proper introduction of the jury I have today. I'll start with Tom Main, the principal of Morphosis and a SCI-Arc instructor, Jeff Kipnis, a professor of architecture from Ohio State University, Dora Epstein-Jones, the chair of Texas Tech University College of Architecture, Jason Young, the director of the School of Architecture at the University of Tennessee, Volkan Akınalı, design director of digital innovation at Nike and the founder of his own firm, Mariana Ibanez, professor of architecture at MIT and a principal at Ibanez Kim, Jason Kelly Johnson, principal of Future Forms and an associate professor at CCA, John Enright, a principal of Griffin Enright Architects and the SCI-Arc vice director. I saw Hernan popped in for a minute, so I'm sure he'll be back. Hernan Diaz Alonso, a principal at HDA and the director of SCI-Arc. Did I get everybody? I believe I did.
Where's Jennifer?
And there's Jennifer. So I'm gonna the first two students are Jennifer and Jaishree. Jennifer, there she is. All right, they are, what do they call this? Quarantining, I think is the term for that.
Right.
Okay, I will turn it over to you. Any questions before they get started?
Is that, no, not for me.
Okay.
Jason, does this have anything to do with I was on a jury, I think last year, year before, where you started with detail and developed a broader concept of a building from detail? Is there a parallel here?
Yes, in the sense that what we didn't start as explicitly with the idea of a detail, but we moved, we made these object-like things, and we very quickly jumped to a detail. So the idea was to jump to it too soon, so that the detail, in many cases, becomes something that you think about as you move back to issues of site and building. So yes, but not as directly. Okay, Jennifer and Jaishree, it's all you.
Hi, I'm Jennifer.
I'm Jaishree.
Let's share screen. Where's the All right, so this semester we've been studying the assembly methods and part-to-whole relationships of the Hanayama puzzle. And these studies resulted in various scales from puzzle to architectural detail to site condition to full building scale. And at the start of the semester, we became interested in the level 4 hexagon Hanayama for its deceptively simple form, which is made up of a frame with hidden track and 3 sliding pieces that rotate about the base in a 2-dimensional manner. At first glance, this level 4 Hanayama seems simple and the 3 sliding pieces look relatively the same. However, they're actually containing hidden locks, which are holding them in place inside the central track. If you try to pull the wrong pieces, they will not move. So you'll have to find the first locked piece that will slide up on the frame before proceeding with the rest of the pieces. Then you have to follow a specific sequence of steps, which will align the pieces in various ways to be able to fit the puzzle pieces through the central void of the frame to be removed. The assembly, in our first reinterpreted version of that original hexagon Hanayama, we wanted to take its rules and its planar qualities and reapply them to a 3-dimensional form. To do this, we looked at the techniques of locking, rotation, and sliding, along with the idea of the hidden void or track to bring about new ways of thinking about how the puzzle really works. In this disassembly instructional drawings, or disassembly as we called it instead of assembly, is accomplished only through a series of specific steps, just like in the original puzzle. While it's clear that the pieces have to slide to disassemble, there's an order that has to be determined before moving them at all. As the puzzle's parts, which are acting as locks, start to slide, there are mended aligned adjacencies within the central void that adjust into a spiral form to twist out the middle piece, which is the final result or end goal of this version of the puzzle. The frame in this case is made up of 4 parts, 3 sliding pieces located on hidden tracks and a base piece which holds these in place. The sequential process starts with one piece that needs to be removed before the other can align with the base. And if aligned properly, the 5th piece within the negative space of this frame can be twisted out.
Our second reinterpreted version of the hexagon Hanayama took a few of the same techniques applied to another 2D form of the puzzle. Our interest in this puzzle was derived from the tessellated geometry coming together as a triple spiral or triskeleton, which makes it difficult to determine which way to move and disguises the pieces that have to come out. Because the original already moved in planar 2-dimensional way, we considered new ways that the puzzle could use, the methods of blocking and sliding, and also the concept of unseen track. Once the wooden pieces acting as locks are removed from the puzzle, the 3 pieces that slide out can be discovered, but why they seem to be only slightly to budge. You then have to guide these pieces through the track, then they're hidden beneath the pieces. While all of the wood pieces are able to be removed, only 3 of them are truly acting as locks. So this can act as a challenge to find which pieces are holding the sliding pieces in place. And as shown here, 3 are left to be removed. To take some of these ideas to an architectural scale, we then moved from designing puzzles to this window or door detail to see how the lock functions as a puzzle itself. This detailed prototype contains as a locking system that must follow similar steps to the previous designs in order to release this mechanism from the frame. To release the lock, you must rotate the middle piece and then releases the arms from the frame, unhinging the window shutter. To relock it, the front piece pushes back in to catch the pegs, which is then be able to lift it back from the frame, and then the middle piece is rotated to lock it back in place.
Then, as a way to realize the reimagined 2D and 3D puzzle at a larger architectural scale, we started to consider the relationships and techniques they had in common in order to pull them together into a site to building condition. About halfway through the semester, our studio began looking at a site on Roosevelt Golf Course in LA. And this simply provided a framework for how the pieces can start to take on more than small footprint of land and continue its own patterns and relationships scattered along the site. Some of the ways that the two came together are shown here. By rotating the object into the site, the effect is a series of impacts onto each other, which start to blur what is site and what is building. Finding these new relationships led us to think about what effect the contiguous parts have on the whole assembly, and what happens when these parts either intersect or only exude a nearness to each other.
Rather than thinking of this as an element placed on a site, we were interested in how the pieces, like the original Hanayama, can rotate into each other and create spaces that once assembled may be unseen, but can be revealed through the shifting patterns. As you get closer to some of these parts, you can see a glimpse of what is on the inside, through the shifted openings. Some of these openings provide a sense of entry from the site through its rotational language.
Cutting into the building component starts to reveal the interlocking patterns at yet another scale to show the ways that the interlocking parts can create a series of spaces of their own entity, but also still being related to one another. And this provides opportunity for what kind of transition spaces might occur and how that might influence programmatic relationships. So we use these disparate parts to dictate spaces for a museum. This first highlighted piece is one of those moments of impact from where the building parts and site parts converge into a new entity. In this space, there would be an auditorium, lecture halls, and below ground storage for the museum's archive. The core is reserved for main entry, circulation, and public spaces such as the museum shops, cafe, and lobby. And this interlocking piece connected through the center of the core is where there would be gallery spaces like permanent and temporary exhibitions. This large portion of the building, which is wrapped around the core, would contain any kind of educational spaces, studios, classrooms, workshop spaces, or offices. And this last one would provide a secondary entry to the core and also have gathering spaces for private events. And it would also have things like loading entries or back of house program.
Details of the interiors of these spaces still take on notes from the Hanayama puzzle by focusing on transitions, adjacencies, and revealing what is hidden. Examples of this can be through main ring circulations, angle cuts that allow you to see through many parts of these buildings. We are looking at the interlocking parts fitting together and revealing what is hidden, or in some cases, revealing the structure itself.
By studying the Hanayama for its architectural qualities, we discover new ways of thinking about the relationship of parts at various scales. In typical puzzles, you get many pieces scattered in a box and you assemble them together. But since the Hanayama puzzle focuses on its disassembly, it highlights that it already exists as one unit or entity. This can apply to architecture at various scales by proving that all parts, details, programs, or site, despite having their own unique functions and characteristics, all make up one entity and their relationship to each other. Thank you.
Thank you.
So I have a, this is Volkan, I have a quick question. I mean, looking at puzzles as a kind of initiator, there's usually a complexity level for puzzles. I'm assuming with Hanamaya is the same, like depending how complex your your pieces are, the higher the number. So 1 is 0, you know, it's the lowest, 10 is the highest. Did you establish a complexity level for your initial puzzles, and did that complexity level translate into the building scale at some point?
I think we were very interested in the complexity of it, but we didn't like come up with our own kind of scale for that of determining what level it would be. But like in the original puzzles up here, we were interested in trying to hide certain things, such as that central spiral void, which you can't see, but until you start moving these pieces around. And then as you start tugging at the middle piece, then it is able to be twisted out. So that, I guess, would add to that level of complexity. And same for this 2D puzzle as well. You can't tell that the sliding pieces here are on tracks until you start to pull at them.
Hi, this is Dora. They come off their tracks though, right? I mean, nothing is joined in a puzzle in the traditional manner. It's not a fixed joint, right?
Actually, one of the pieces on the 3D puzzle, this large black piece is attached to the base, but the 2 wooden pieces here are able to be removed.
But that's your puzzle study. That's not from the Hanayama. I mean, the principle of the Hanayama,
that was our own interpretation of it.
Right, is that there's no such thing as a fixed joint, right? They slide into each other, and it's the sliding into each other that creates the connection.
Mm-hmm. Yes.
You seem to make some conceptual leap from 2D to 3D. When I was looking at your first part of your presentation, the puzzle, I was already thinking that a bit of a problem in the 2-dimensional nature of the puzzle you're looking at, and then it seems like it's to an extrusion, which is going to be somewhat simple. And then as I look at the slide you're showing, I'm not quite clear, like the silver piece on the lower image on the right, because once it leapt into the 3, go to image 16.
Image 16. I'm sorry, I don't. 16.
It was really, I was already anticipating a problem in the puzzle. And then I looked at this image and I realized that you made, even on the flat pieces, you made some conceptual leap into 3-dimensionality, right?
Right.
I'm using the more, and then the 3D, could you talk about that a little bit? You seem to make, because there's gonna be another set of questions now having to do with the a prioriness of the whole idea. And when, because then there's another kind of a leap as you show sections, and it kind of took me by surprise because I wasn't anticipating that it was going to be a building that accommodated complex functions, starting with theater, et cetera, et cetera. And there's another kind of a leap made that went from the a prioriness of the formal idea to something that was kind of highly specific in functional terms. Can you talk about that a bit?
Of course. So as you said, like it was a difficult transition going from this, and our first thought was looking at the kind of tessellation and like turning it into an extrusion, but then we decided to take on just the kind of theoretical qualities of how this moves upon itself, and the kind of the methods behind it to translate to this. So then it's just taking on the things like locking and sliding to get this puzzle pulled apart, and also rotation. Then translating that to 2D. Do you want to talk about that?
The original Hanayama puzzle had these very obvious movements where you twist, you pull, and then you slide along the tracks, and the puzzle piece drops down. So that was the thing we used even for the 3D and the 2D puzzle. For the 3D, where you twist it out through the void. And for the 2D, we follow the same way where you lift the wooden pieces and then the black pieces, as you can see, they slide out from the hidden tracks. But not all the wooden pieces act as locks. They're just there to make it more playful.
So
And then
who's asking questions now? Tom, are you still asking questions?
I'm listening. Yeah, go for it.
Oop, did I lose everybody?
okay, so then yeah, as we moved on to like turning this into a building site condition, rather than just kind of placing it on the site, we wanted to see then how they would like translate into one another through some of those same gestures as the previous puzzles. So then as you start to like twist it onto the site, then there's, as we said, this kind of series of impacts that happens. And then there's program that starts to penetrate the ground.
Go back one. What's in that circle seems to be really key to your strategy.
Yeah, of course.
For me, I need a little, just to understand the project, because it ends up being a discourse on part whole, I would say. Your final thing is absolutely now connected to a very different idea of the relationship of part and the kind of continuity it makes up, or the discontinuity, or the kind of the relationship makes up of a new whole, or right, the connective tissue. And it seems that a lot of it is involved in this somehow in this translation. Am I correct?
Yeah, that's
What's
very
in the
correct.
No.
Oh,
I mean, you're right. You're correct in the sense that its relationship to the puzzle, the parts whole relationship of the puzzle are imitated in the part whole relationship of the model of the project. But the architecture of the project, in the end, does it reflect the part whole relationship of the puzzle? So, I mean, this is very important because there's this illusion of part to whole. So Tom, I want to ask two questions to support your question. Okay, I don't want to change the subject. Very important. Okay. Let me just ask them two questions, and then because I think you've asked a very important question. Is this a part to whole relationship or isn't it? So can I just ask, in support of Tom's interrogation, so when you build this building, will you be able to take it apart?
I think we had considered that at first, but I think this has more to do with the kind of adjacencies and the suggestion of moving and relation of parts.
Okay, so when you talk about the architectural quality of the puzzle, but what we're ending up with is the puzzle quality of the architecture. So in the end, the puzzle is not attached to a ground. I lift it up. It's independent of any site.
well, some of it is. Go back to 16. Put 16 on.
Yeah, so the puzzle itself has familiar parts. It's independent of any relationship to a table. All of its parts, they may be different from what you would expect. They're not idiosyncratic. Plus, its very quality is that it goes back. It's able to be taken apart and put back together. Listen, I admire very much the degree to which you can re-originate the process of the puzzle into the process of producing elements of a building in relationship to the ground. But for example, the puzzle's total distinction from any site it ever might be relationship to, and your building's absolute integration into the site means that the architectural relationships between the two are antagonistic to one another. But fundamentally, in the end, if you imagine to project this model into a building, the question of does it come apart? Do I read the legacy history of the puzzle as an instrument of disassembly and reassembly, as an instrument of trickery, as an instrument of that I put in my pocket and carry with me as a distraction? Or does it read as a beautifully crafted sculptural element in a very specific site relationship with an interesting distraction of the narrative of its origin? None of this is criticism, but it's a different take of your project. And that's why, does it really have part to whole relationships or not, is all I'm asking you.
Yeah, so
You haven't said a word about the architecture.
So I think this video will best kind of explain.
No, only
the way
you
that
can explain it. No
No, but
video.
I mean, as a visual, as I explained. So the way that these
I
pieces,
understand how it works. You don't have to show me this again.
yes, I'm just using it as supplement to what I'm about to say.
Okay.
So,
this is the site, right?
correct.
So after this is finished, can you take this apart from the site when it's built?
I mean, if you want to lift up a building piece.
Yes, I want to know, for example, do you know why real estate is called real estate?
Question.
Yes or no?
It's
Because a building, real estate is different from personal property, and a building is different from personal property because it's permanently attached to the ground. And your building and that site is permanent. Now, the fact that it imitated the model in its conception and development is fascinating. And I do think producing a permanent building whose legacy and history is one of a mobile puzzle, if you brought that discourse of the puzzle into architecture to displace its history of storytelling as one of permanence and placemaking, so that your permanent placemaking was all of a sudden destabilized and made agile in perception and conception, but not in fact, then the project would make a lot of sense. But if you keep holding to the fact that you've instantiated the reality of the puzzle in the building as a matter of fact, then you're either deluding yourself or you don't quite understand what you've done. As spectacular as it is. It's like, for example, all of the idiosyncrasy of the forms and their connections and relationship to the site have nothing to do with that puzzle. So I love the project and I love the process. I would like to get the two connected. More importantly, I'd like it to become a work of architecture.
Oh,
Well,
nice
I
a
can
piece of
see-
architecture. Show
I
another
probably should say
overall view of
goodbye
the
now.
object.
What did you say?
Show one of the details of the thing itself. Yeah, 22 is fine. Huh. Show one this more space. Do you see the spaces between? Yeah, that's okay. God, I think this is I have to say, I find the dynamicism of and the residual nature or the whatever the spaces between the elements really powerful. And as you started drawing the architectural sections, I think I would have spent a little more time concentrating on there's definitely the primary spatial type is the space between these elements before you start breaking down the stuff inside. And because if they're really powerful, you're not quite looking at them. Are you with me? The space between the things versus the starting of the articulation of the elements themselves that represent the parts. I find super intriguing. That one, I have no idea how you got here still from the 2D. The 2D, it makes total sense to me on the site. And the lifting I mean, they're very different kind of relationships here. The very fine, the little thin slices versus the ones that are very spatial between the silver and the black, left and right. And then the horizontal one between the ground as you lifted the dark element, right? That separated from the ground. Because this whole element in terms of how it connects or disconnects from the ground. Jeffrey, doesn't it help, that disconnection, or the understanding of the disconnection versus the fact that they didn't extrude it up becomes really important here?
Well, I think that there are things in this particular image that are not necessarily carried through, you know, in the concept, and we can compare this, say this particular image. Can you show us the section from the same? You have the section from pretty much the same vantage, the cut, yeah. I mean, I would think that if there were this kind of loose fit between each of these pieces, and that's part of the proof of concept, is that there's just enough of that loose fit to create these sort of offsets, we wouldn't see, say, the implication that the floor plate cuts all the way through, or we wouldn't see a kind of stopped wall. That there are, in other words, what I'm seeing is spatial continuities in the final project that defeat many of the potentials that are offered by continually thinking of this not as parts to whole, but just parts to parts. And if they could be kind of just parts to parts, it seems that there could be, not just as Jeff is indicating, a kind of different relationship to the ground, which actually might be indicated in this model, but also that you know, we would begin to see a little bit more of a kind of productive disjunction between each of these, instead of a move toward their fitting together, a little bit of the kind of spatial enunciations that happen because they don't exactly fit together, because there is that just enough that happens. It creates that void that's so nice in that model that Tom was pointing out, what number 22. A new nomenclature of slide 22.
But it's interesting, Dora, when you change to the sectional drawing, it seems as like you would want to understand I like the idea of part to part versus part to whole. It makes sense. But now you go to the section, the middle piece. God, we need to draw. When you look at it with the stair and then the series of spaces, it seems like one of the options would be to understand that as your new, what is it? It's a continuity of understanding that as a part, as being in itself entity. And you would have redone the whole inside of that to understand that as it becomes a whole to some level, right? It becomes something that you understand has its own integrity as part, and that would keep going as you start organizing the elements. It seems that would have really radically, and then the stuff between is the public, is the connective tissue. That would have really changed your kind of approach to the next level of planning.
You're going to have to forgive me, but this is doing something that I think is not a good idea. So I'm just going to say this one thing. I'm probably going to say it this one time. It's probably going to apply to every review. And then from now on, Tom and Dora and the experts on this panel that are architecture experts can do what you're doing, which is actually a great thing to do. But what I need to say to Jennifer and so the two architects is this: you need to learn, and all the other students need to learn the idea of a heuristic device. Okay, just give me 1 second on this and then I'm done. A heuristic device is a device that you use to do the work you want to do. Like, you've used the puzzle as a heuristic device to do this project. However, It is the nature of a heuristic device that its properties and its ability to stimulate your imagination and your working in another discipline do not translate from the device to the new discipline. So you've used that puzzle as a complex, sophisticated, stimulating heuristic device to do this architectural project, which you now must consider as an architectural project, develop and think about as an architectural project. And you have done that using your instincts, but not using your knowledge. And therefore you've, some of the parts that are great because you have great artistic instincts. And now you're being criticized for your rather banal attitude about the relationship between a work of architecture and the functions of a building. So I'm not saying this to you in a pejorative sense. I'm saying this to you as a teacher. As a teacher, I'm telling you, learn what a heuristic device is and realize that your use of the puzzle was one. And now learn the difference between architectural effects and building effects, because this section is filled with banal building effects, and all the rest of the jury want to praise you for the beauty of your architectural effects. And I don't even think you know what they're talking about.
I was gonna, can I just jump in? The one thing that I would add here is that I actually don't know enough about the project to criticize it in the way that Jaishree is. I don't think we actually know enough about the void spaces to really understand what you're trying to do. And I think for me the most interesting thing that I'm seeing here is that you're treating the void spaces like puzzle pieces, right? So it is actually slightly different than the model you're starting with. I think the void has become a part. So it's a void to part to whole relationship. And I think that's actually pretty interesting, but I'd want to know a little bit more. This is a project where I wish I could pour some cast resin into all the void spaces and kind of deliberately take the rest of the project away and actually interrogate the void spaces for what they are. They're actually potentially quite rich. And they really do have this kind of interlocking kind of quality to them, but I want to know more about them, because I feel like those void spaces are maybe more impactful than all the other stuff. I think it's for me to just sort of look at this single section cut and then the exterior, it's been difficult to access what I think might be really rich spaces. The other thing I'll just add is that, you said it's a series of impacts that created the project. I agree with Jaishree that perception could have entered into this. Moving through the spaces could have become an impact, and that might have been coupled with these void spaces. So you started to understand how somebody moving through the spaces could almost unlock the spaces, and there could be a series of kind of studies of just sort of moving up through the image we're looking at. So right now, I actually don't understand the project. I understand the assembly and the parts, the voids to the parts to the whole, but I don't quite understand how that adds up, whether it's architecture, art, or just a study of light. You could actually pitch this as essentially just it's a light, it's a play on kind of light and void, and not even worry about whether it's a piece of architecture or not.
I have a question, actually, just following. I know, Jeff, that you want to just shut up at this moment, but I want to ask a follow-up question because I'm intrigued about how do you teach? I think we've gotten to a point where the heuristic device does have to be sort of rigorously understood, right? That it's not merely a technique anymore, And so, do you think that there's a point in the project in which they should have, say, redone the Villa Savoie as a set of interlocking puzzle pieces to understand what are the potentials? Or, I mean, how do they get at understanding the potentials of this heuristic device?
Listen, in my entire life as a teacher, I've never taught a project that came out this good. So I know all about the theory of teaching, and I can talk about it when I see it. I'm not half the teacher that, you know, Dwayne is. I mean, so but if you go back and you look at early on, if you go back up to the early projects, one of the striking things about this project is that the elements of the puzzle, go back up to where you see that silver tower element. There, stop. If you look at that slide, each of those pieces, each of the elements of that particular puzzle is already so spectacularly beautifully designed. And the fact that everybody on this jury looks at that and stipulates that as if to say, oh, those are just going to be obviously the pieces of this puzzle, and doesn't say, where the hell does that come from? Look at that spectacular silver piece. It looks like, it reminds me a little bit of a wonderful piece by Co-op Himmelblau that looks like it's half dancing with a foot. I mean, every piece in that image is so beyond sophistication as an element of architectural form that it would take us a week to unpack. And yet I'm now going to watch them put this together like it's some kind of puzzle. It's bizarre. And then the next thing I know, I see this flat jigsaw puzzle. So the fact that that the studio has been collapsed for the purposes of this jury into this heuristic element is the least architectural part of it, although it's very interesting that it became the dominant means by which all this intuitional material came forward. So the reason I'm saying this is that if we really were to become more rigorous about how to do the teaching, this would become less and less and less and less interesting. And I don't think that it would mean we would understand how to use a heuristic device better. And after a couple of years, we could go back to this. I don't think that's a great idea. You go right to this. This is exactly what you want to happen in the studio. I don't want to change this. I just want to change, let's discuss this more and more and more as architecture and less and less and less as a process without, I don't think we need to be rigorous about the process. I don't really think we need to know more than the process happened a little bit. And but I do feel sad. I think it was Jason. I mean, he said it beautifully. If you look at the colored model, the spaces, the darks, the shadows, if you look at the architecture and then you look at the section and you want to know, why can't there be a deeper relationship between the architectural qualities and have it permeate the project more? Now, I don't know how you do it. I see people that can do it, but I recognize it when it's done, but how you make it happen, I don't know. But I know one thing, this process won't do it.
But it seems like, Jeffrey, that it has to do with when you jettison the initial type of questions you're asking that are connected to the conceptual basis of the project. Go back to the section, your drawing section, and it moves into more clearly architectural issues. And it's a shift of the whole way of thinking about the project and when that takes place. And whether that they can now, they can understand the potential of their own invention. Because I would have said here now, there's a radical shift in conversation having to do with the interpretation of this initial strategy. And I think they've, I would, at this point, I don't know what the conversation was in the studio, but the conversation would have radically shift to the nature of the organizational strategy as it now takes place within an architectural setting.
But how do you do it? I mean, how do you go from that black model to the white model without having this happen?
You shift the whole structure of the conversation shifts. The terms of the conversation shift. Like I'm saying, in this one, I look at it and there's an absolute kind of shift in the space between. And by the way, I assume, Dwayne, that this was very much part of your discussion, because what I find interesting here from a translation from the puzzle, it was mentioned earlier that the spaces between the shape of the puzzle are inconsequential. It's not spatial. They're just lines that make shapes. They have, by exploding the puzzle or whatever, have talked about the dynamicism of its construction, of its movement that goes back to the original movement of the piece, maybe. And then, because they produce these very dynamic spaces. And I would have said the first thing in the discussion now architecturally is a radical shift between that type of space between and the space is now made of the objects themselves. Two complete different terms, and that would have changed how this drawing would have been made. But you change the term of the conversation, and there could be someone else could give another interpretation than the one that I gave. And then some of them, the spaces between that are very thin, how do those even get perceived, or how are they used conceptually?
Yeah, last comment from Hernan.
Yeah, just to add to the noise, I'm not sure. I don't think there is a change in conversation. I don't know, to try to relate to what Tom and Jeff and Jason and Dora, everybody's mentioned. To me, there is a couple of things to consider. First of all, I think the project is spectacular, so kudos to that. But I would argue that I think any of these processes, and either we go to the device approach to Jeff or the other comments is, I think it's about the distribution between the relation between imagination and knowledge. And I think it starts with a kind of a pretended idea of knowledge based on the puzzle, which again, we can argue later how we can read that. I read, for example, puzzles always relation part to part. I don't think puzzles never establish a whole, really, it's a collection of parts, but that's a different conversation for another time. But what I would argue is why you move from one territory to another. Look, for me, you guys, in the puzzle part, there was a language of precision that it was what fascinates you guys. And I don't think that became like an armature that need to carry all the way. I would call it that the knowledge part. And there's a moment and then imagination takes over. And I think, for example, the pieces that you do in a three-dimensional puzzle, which are exquisite, are very different than the original knowledge of the puzzle, and it's became imagination because the pieces don't fit quite perfect anymore. So there's a transformation that takes into another territory. So I personally would be much more intrigued if everybody starts to articulate the relation between knowledge and imagination, which I would say is a pretty generic thing that every architect does. But there are always a couple of bridges that relates those two parts. And I think we established that, and I think in your project is fairly easy to do. I think then everybody will relax a little bit about the anxiety that make other things we come with. And I think then the elements that they come with the banality, prosaic quality architecture need to come in play, and we need to put that. And I think it's important that the project expose those things and the limitations of that, because in a way, for me, always final resolution of architecture is about negotiating those limitations. But I want to reemphasize, it's all about to establish what are the bridge between knowledge to imagination. And I will argue that most of the devices that we use to trigger projects, to me, are mechanisms to acquire certain knowledges, and then we can manipulate into form of imagination. And to me, that's where the game is. And I assume that most of the projects we're gonna see, they're gonna keep bouncing around that problem. That's it. That's all I have.
Okay, with that, we're going to move to Isabel and Irv. Thank you very much, Jaishree and Jennifer.
Thank you. Thank you.
Very beautiful project, really an astounding project.
Thank you so much.
Good morning.
Hi.
Hi.
Okay.
Just let me know when you're ready.
All right. So my name is Isabel.
My name is Urban.
Thank you guys for joining us this morning, taking your time. We really appreciate it. So in any Hanayama puzzle, a specific configuration is required in order to unlock the pieces. In some cases, a sequence of moves is also required. In our original puzzle, you'll find a unique elegance in the unlocking of the pieces. However, this elegant reveal is not initially obvious. The two essential aspects in solving this puzzle are the alignment of seams and the transverse curve connecting them apart. When these two stipulations are observed, the puzzle can be unlocked. The puzzle's elegance is not only descriptive of the unexpected figures which it reveals, but also in the quintessential moment of its undoing. Upon unlatching the puzzle pieces, the voluptuous forms which exist as highly specific connection points can be discovered. Existing within an entirely orthogonal bounding box, we created our 3D puzzle to defy expectations of its movement even more dramatically than the original. The transverse rotation, which we adopted from our original Hanayama puzzle, has become more discrete and unexpected when hidden within the form of a bounding box. The dynamic relationship between the two halves of the puzzle creates a diverse set of orientations. The role of the clear massing and its effect on the reading of the puzzle as a whole changes in each of the orientations. With the intention of rejecting the duplicity which occurs in the original piece, curves and striations are imposed onto the form of the box. And then these carvings act to conceal the true seam which is required in order to unlock the puzzle and also introduce perspective, rotations, and hinges. So we wanted to create a two-dimensional puzzle that still had the ability to convey these three-dimensional connections, but also maintain this concept of the square bounding box. So we ended up manifesting these rotations coming from the original puzzle as spiral pieces that need to literally be rotated in order to fit into the puzzle. These pieces have overlapping and hugging relationships to one another and to the 2D puzzle which they sit on. The distinction between the puzzle and the pieces which fit in it is intentionally misconstrued. Hatching also appears in this puzzle in order to track the movements of these smaller puzzle pieces as they rotate into the larger puzzle. And we continue to develop this idea of seams in this puzzle, where some exist as false seams and yet others represent the true separation of pieces.
The puzzle brought questions of scale from its seams, etchings, and rotations. What follows is a mullion that introduces as a handrail as well. The handrail to mullion detail follows the curvature of the surface, similar to the surfaces of the original Hanayama puzzle. From the exterior side, the handrail peeks out and follows the direction of the diagonal panels. The etchings from the original puzzle are translated to the scale of this detail in a manner that focuses on depth and sort of misreading.
So as we continue to explore this puzzle at varying scales, we kept the integrity of the original rotation in our larger explorations of relationships. So borrowing from the approach presented in our 2D puzzle, hatches track the puzzle piece as it transverses across the site presented here.
The site is viewed as an assembly with two principles, these two being the overlapping of parts and a sort of tertiary piece connecting pieces at the same level. These are considered green pieces. These are tertiary pieces, while the overlapping method is applied anytime a change in the level happens in the site. The objects along the site are added afterwards. There's an over-under connection that is defined through the site's extractive zones, allowing objects to connect and lock in place. The building to the site relationship achieves the level of completeness through these connections. The same green pieces are translated as like transparent pieces that were in the 3D puzzle, but this time assigned as either public venues or greenhouses laid along the site. These objects are referred to as keys in the project.
So these interlocking pieces reappear on our site, but again, with different scalar relationships to the puzzle. So rather than treating our site as a one massing, one ground relationship, we started to occupy the site at different scales, creating the beginning of a field-like approach where each piece leaves a trace of its movement or connection.
The museum overlooks the Hollywood sign facing the west end. Beneath the cliff would be a sort of entrance on the flatter ends and general parking. The after images of the building and the keys are splattered along the site as deep indentions for possible greenery or seating. They appear as a hatch following the direction of the somewhat offset from the original object. The understanding of the site operations, such as overlapping, continued in the development of the project. The cliff portion is the base of the museum, and the building's connections orient itself under yet over. From its north face, the museum is embedded into the back end of the cliff, and its east side having a dramatic cantilever. The translation of materials follow the same principle the 3D puzzle had. Transparency and the transparent pieces are different shades of black. In the case, the shades of black are accomplished through a slider rain screen. The rain screen on the west end of the museum that faces the Hollywood sign and the darker side of the building result in a matte finish. The hatching in the 3D puzzle translated to opening behind the rain screen of the museum, further emphasizing the lighter end of the building and a dark end. The hatch of the building that follows the same rotation on the site. So basically at the top of the building, there's a sort of hatching that follows the same rotation that was originally shown in the sort of drawing of the assembly of the site.
So we began to explore the assembly of this section using the same criteria which one would apply to the configuration of a puzzle. So we returned to explore the material qualities of transparency versus opaqueness and how this could affect the programmatic layout of the building. So for us, this meant the glorification of this moment where the two puzzle pieces rotate in to complete another. Additionally, the central circulation of the staircase acts as a physical manifestation of the rotation of our puzzle at a more tactile human scale. And as Irv mentioned, the museum has this relationship of a more private end and a more public end based on the light that's allowed.
The section model is treated like a puzzle itself. Rather than cutting a traditional section, the transparent piece and that sort of secondary gallery or sort of arm you're seeing down there are attached to the model or would be attached to this part of the model and could connect to maybe perhaps the other half of this section. The hatching on the facade brings light to the top end of the gallery, while the transparent pieces extend the principle to the rest of the building. The atrium connections to the back transparent piece, which also holds a staircase that runs parallel to its direction, following one of the entrances at the ground level. You can kind of see that in the back of the building here. This section itself is just another puzzle, but speaks to programmatic assembly as an interlocking of parts.
So we truly understood each piece of the section as a distinct part. Each piece received unique treatment dependent on its programmatic role. So for example, by repurposing the striations, which previously implied the movement of the 3D puzzle, for example, on the site, we've developed a strategy to allow light into the building, focusing especially on the designated social spaces and circulation points. So like the composition of the puzzles which we've shown you, the section is assembled in several different parts. We considered how the pieces could relate not just by sitting adjacent to one another, but by latching onto and literally wrapping around each other, thus returning to the unexpected rotation and connection of our original puzzles. Thank you.
Thank you.
I have a general question, and maybe it goes to Dwayne, but particularly first of all, nice project. The first puzzle you showed was amazing. With the cylinder, the twist. But I have a question about sight and how the sight is treated. Why? Okay, it's been mentioned already before quite well. I think this idea of parts and parts. But why is the site and the terrain integrated into these pieces? Like if I had this problem and this setup, I would be not integrating it into the site. I'd be detaching it because it seems, as Jeff pointed out really well, I think this notion of what's real property that's attached to the ground. But you're going to try to articulate this as detached from the ground, in a sense. And that's one of the most difficult things. How do you perceive these pieces when they touch the ground? Because of course they get absorbed because they're buildings. And how you can still articulate them as pieces that would be essentially detached. So it seems peculiar to me that the projects engage the ground and mimic the formal language and try to interlock with it, as opposed to becoming completely detached where you can understand them as pieces.
I would argue that the ground is what's mimicking the relationship of the building to itself. We could have looked at the building as a distinct piece. We could have, thrown it in a block in New York, but we specifically wanted a large site where we could explore the idea of architecture relating to the site, where you're confused about where the beginning ends and where it starts. The purpose of the exercise of the site for us is to confuse and distort those two things, where architecture is no longer just about the one monumental building, but what about when you're walking up to it? What about your experience when you're walking up to it? What about the site that's around it? It's not just some banal parking lot that you're walking through. So the idea is to kind of extend the project past just one building.
Maybe just trying to enter the project in a different way. I'm still trying to figure out how closely to the original puzzle is worth staying and how much departing, because the puzzle itself is so fascinating and different from the previous project. It was already a very three-dimensional object. To a certain degree, just as a game, you could have tried to cut a section of that final piece and turn it into a building and see what it produces. But then you also did a fantastic project going through all these kind of techniques of transposition from one idea to the other that turns either the form of the puzzle or the process through which it's assembled. In this case, just by using, for example, pure black, you mimic some of the part-to-part relationships and how they are transformed as the pieces come together or spread apart. I wanted to pick up on two things that I find very interesting in the slides and in the project. One is maybe slides 7 and 10. That in a sense, there was the suggestion that once the puzzle is all put together, there are things that happen on the interior that are not necessarily accessible or observable when you look at this as an object. I love the idea that all of these pieces that seem to have like a tight fit relationship where there's all pure tangency, right? All the edges are touching other edges or other surfaces. But here there's a suggestion that as the pieces come together, there's actually voids or loose fits between the parts that I find extremely intriguing as imagining this as a piece of architecture. And then towards the end of your presentation, Isabel, you said something that you imagined that each one of these parts was completely independent from one another. And I saw that that could be both an organizational and a typological opportunity. And in that sense, I wonder if you can further distinguish them from one another, where one of these pieces can use a model of stacked slabs, while another one could be pure verticality, while another one could be inward looking, and another one could be all about the perimeter, and so on and so forth. So I wonder, how can you play this game of the pieces having to be very similar to one another in one way, but architecturally offer very different possibilities in another? So if somehow the pedagogy of the studio is, and I think Hernan said it quite beautifully, connecting this idea between knowledge and imagination, which are the aspects from the puzzle that you carry forward. But the moment that you turn this, there was also a very specific moment in your presentation when you started calling this a building. Before it was like a project or the puzzle. And that moment where this becomes a building, that you can use the stuff of buildings to perhaps exaggerate the difference between each one of these parts. Actually, this image that you have now up is kind of perfect, right? Like I see a lot of pancake slabs, and it makes me want to more extremely fine differences between them that are perhaps hard to fit, right? Again, the tower, the atrium, the center versus the perimeter. But at the same time, finding the relationships that makes all of them part of the same puzzle when they come together.
So you're suggesting potentially involving different typologies within one building and having those typologies being treated as the different pieces.
It's just, I think the part-to-part argument that Dora brought in the previous project and the way you described this as a collection of independent entities fits really well. So I want to see that more exaggerated through architectural strategies.
Yeah, I agree, absolutely.
But the horizontal nature of the organization in this grouping destroys any independence of the objects, right? Works directly against you in terms of your major premise, right? And again, it's just understanding the implication of your conceptual strategy is quite clear here. And unlike the other one, which utilized the space between, this one is, I think, more dependent on the of these spaces as the interior to the objects becomes much more important in terms of their understanding and differentiation, in terms of the nature of the strategy of the elements, right? Where the other one was literally disconnected, and you had the very dynamic, the spatial, the spaces between, right? Were already allowing you to understand, right? The differentiation of the part. Is anybody interested in the, because in both of these, there's they're incredibly disciplined, and you arrive at something that's you sense a finishedness and kind of an end to the project. But there's a leap between the formal configuration, and then as you move into its accommodation, where the floors show up and the users show up, there's a leap. And I'm just curious if the strategy is malleable enough or flexible enough to make the changes now necessary as it shifts from the conceptual organization into a range of complex accommodations. Because they seem like they just show up now, and they seem to somehow just work, and you can make them into various, whatever the functionalities are, from theater to the various shapes. But that it's going to require a kind of a formal accommodation to actually make the project work, and that the strategy has to have that capability. That it isn't a finite, singular kind of a direction, right? That now it has to have an ability to adapt to a program that hasn't been part of the thinking of the project.
Yeah, it's a good question. It definitely relies on either taking that into account in the early stages, or as you say, accepting a malleability to the puzzle that will require working through that. I don't know that we got to the point that we can completely evaluate that question. I think if you looked at where they were, and this is true of every group, a month ago, one of the things that you'd find or that I found is that the tendency was to first put those floor plates in a way that didn't maintain the degree of separation of components or of parts that you now find. And so there is a kind of presumption that this relative size and adjacency of the pieces would work programmatically. That probably hasn't been worked through properly. I want to say something about a couple of issues that have come up. One being the site question is a very good question, and I'm just sort of pondering, since you asked that, of why we're doing that. Part of it is I had been thinking about the distinction between treating a site as essentially particularly in a lot of these projects that are about part-to-whole relationships, treating an object, treating a building as though it's an object on a pedestal, versus the absolute antithesis of that, and that is a building that is sort of smooth and works to integrate itself into a site in a more seamless way. It seems to me that there's a kind of in-between strategy that allows the site to become integrated without relying on a smoothness or a pure integration. That the site itself could be thought of as parts. And so you, in a sense, build your own site specificity out of parts, particularly, and that's why I chose a golf course. It's already sort of segmented. It's big enough that you can build your own site. And so site specificity becomes a way of thinking yourself about how to take a building apart and a site apart and then put them back together so that you simultaneously maintain autonomy of parts while having continuity. In the same way that these puzzles are often, there's a very clear sense of a whole or a complete puzzle while maintaining their sense of parts. One last thing about the larger issue that Jeff is bringing up about this idea of puzzle. The point of doing the translation of the puzzles is very quickly the students made their own puzzles. And I throughout the studio, I think while I kept saying, what does this have to do with the puzzle? The point was never to continue to mimic one aspect of the puzzle. I think the idea was to mine it for a lot of different ideas. In this case, the striations, the sense of misfit, the sort of misdirects that make you want to put it together in a different way, the rotation. But I did feel like the more you rely on the singular aspect of the puzzle, the more dead the project becomes very quickly because of the sort of singular driving concept. So the point is very well understood, but the premise here was to translate as quickly as we could into their own creative act. That sounds a little grandiose, but their own creative act as quickly as possible in order to be building on their own set of ideas rather than simply saying, does it do what the puzzle does, which is relatively singular at a glance.
But this idea of site, hey, Jaishree, I'm working on your real estate. Do you think it's somewhat antiquated kind of an idea that today site and in terms of its idea of nature is a completely kind of rethought idea? And I would have said we have complete control of the eggshell of the globe, which is a thousandth of an eggshell, by the way. And it includes the atmosphere and certainly the first X hundreds of meters that is absolutely constructed nature. Wouldn't that shift the kind of whole notion of how we even talk about site?
Yes. I was just thinking that, there's just, you never know when a group of students are entering into a field with a discourse that for some of us is 40 years old and 30 years old and 20 years old, and they're walking into it, and I'm thinking about your project at Cincinnati, and all the projects you did that integrate the building directly into a ground, and so much work that was done about connecting the building to an existing ground, and then that was considered a landscape architecture. That became a completed project, and then there was how long this problem has gone on and how many buildings there are that one can go back and think about. And of course, they can't possibly know all that. Jennifer and Dwayne know all it, but so to see these buildings integrated to a site. But then the reason I'm saying that is to answer your question. So there was this one project, however, briefly, if I can mention it, it was the Agadir Convention Center by OMA. And it was built on a box. It was to be in the desert, but if you looked at the project itself, it was built, let's say, on a plinth, and the plinth itself had an imitation of the desert landscape as one of its sockles, as one of its surfaces. And I was thinking to myself, what would be really interesting about these projects is if the ground that we were looking at were not the ground, but a thing that sat on the ground. You know what I mean? That it was actually a fake landscape, kind of like a plinth or a sockle.
But again, I'm making a more overt constructed landscape.
Yes, exactly. But in other words, so it could actually get up and move. So that there was this sense that it belonged to a site, but it was as agile and mobile as we would like to think of our buildings now. Because for me, this notion of architecture wanting to be in a place, it has real political implications. It has to do also with the fact that we keep producing pleasure in the site, which localizes our political consciousness and makes us ever more withdrawn from world problems in a way that architects are never meant to do. You know, I mean, we look out of our window, we make picture windows, glass windows, and we look at it at pastoral sites that we create for ourselves. Then we go back and watch on TV and we see all the problems in Syria and stuff. I mean, it's just, there's a way architecture has to stop. Oh my God, sorry, to my dogs. Hush. I know, everybody's got to laugh.
I like the take. I like the take of your dog.
But there is, you know, there's a way that all of this is not just, you know, qualities in the abstract of detection. Where the site is and how the site is and how we produce the site in relationship to the context, isn't just it's not a linear and stays the same. We constantly create, we have the opportunity to create the artificiality and the here-ness or there-ness, not only of the building, but of the site that it's on and its relationship to the context, political and real that we're in. And so just looking at these models slightly differently, even if the student isn't aware of it or not attentive to it, they've absorbed a lot of this knowledge just because, you know, they enter into the discipline, they absorb it almost intuitively. So, I know it's, but you understand, in a sense, I'm trying to answer your question. So the problems that they think they're taking up, the relationship to the building, to the ground, and the ground to the context, are has so much, I don't know how, and Dora could help here. It has so much history. I mean, recent history, 30 years of history from Zaha, you know, it just goes all the way back, and landscape urbanism. When you look at these models, you have to see them in a different way in order to bring them back alive. And you know, I just think thinking of that piece as a piece, not as all building, that's the way it was in Agadir, but really just physicalized context. Does that make any sense? I feel like I'm rambling now. So.
I think that on this particular project, in comparison to the last one, these gaps that are incorporated into the site by, you know, basically being trapped into the figure of the overall project are pretty interesting, you know, with relative to this conversation about, you know, where the design begins and ends, what is the nature of the void, what does the project begin to enroll by virtue of this ambition to remake the site. So if you go to 17, I believe it's like zoomed out enough that, so I'm very interested in these holes in the project that I would imagine are where golf course is or whatever the site condition is. And I think there's another one in the interior of this, and I thought it was handled pretty interestingly when you inserted the piece that was the circulation and conveyance of the building. And you see that as maybe also a moment of kind of normative behavior, you know, architectural promenade, but maybe that's the wrong term anymore, but normative experiential behavior that gets injected into the middle of this, let's say, puzzle behavior. And I think that's pretty interesting in this project, just in comparison to the last one. It's not a complaint against the last one, but the condition of the site on the previous one was kind of all encompassing. Here, you know, and Jason Johnson was saying, you know, what's the nature of the void in the previous project? Here, I get a sense that there's, you know, it's not so much that these are literal voids, but there's an interruption, let's say, of puzzleness on behalf of other kind of normative architectural behavior that I think starts to kind of, produce a different kind of relationship that makes this conversation, it makes this project seem a little bit more sophisticated to this conversation about what is the extent of the project and what are the incentives built into the project. And I think here, the experience of this thing, I think would incentivize its puzzleness. I didn't really get the sense in the last project.
Jason, can I ask you a question?
Yeah.
Forgive this. This is me watching too much TV by myself. So imagine that you're not looking at a building on a site, but that you're looking at a big battleship, or you guys pick one of your slides that makes the whole thing look like an aircraft carrier. Go up, you know, but like number, no, up. So it's a kind of like a cross section of the whole thing. But if the whole thing was like an aircraft carrier,
Go to 17.
21 is, yeah, or anyone, that's good, just that. Okay, so let's say that's it's like that, and it's on that golf course. And the next day you come to the golf course and it's moved on the golf course. Look, or hit 21, for example. You know, if the whole thing was on the golf course and it didn't sit still, it kind of floated around the golf course, so that it went from being a pastoral thing to a work of armament, to a threatening thing. So that it started to have a narrative, so that it started to tell a different architectural story of, this is a good place. This is something that Tom and I and some others have been talking about, that I keep thinking we need to put our architecture not only in our representation, but in reality, in different settings, and so that it conveys different messages that are not always pastoral, not always always in the same key that you see. If you watch Westworld, you see it all the time. Actually, what's really funny is every time they show Los Angeles in Westworld this season, they keep calling it London. And when they're in Singapore, they keep calling that Los Angeles. And it's very dislocating, and they're doing it on purpose. And then they'll show, anyway, I won't go into it, but I mean, you'll be on the top of the Standard Hotel, and you'll be looking over the banister of the Standard Hotel, and you'll be looking at Wolf Prix's high school. So,
Jaishree, this slide is interesting because it represents the conversation of a complete shift in the type of thinking that's taking place now. And that you move from the initial kind of idea of puzzle to site. And it's going to now use the elements of puzzle in some way that's much more prescriptive to a new set of interests in site. And you kind of radically simplify the kind of thinking. And you now think about site, because I'm with you. I look at this and I would have gone, this thing's sitting this way, and now the piece below is completely misconstrued. It's going to do this, and it's going to do this, and it's going to be digging and you're going to start rethinking, how do I use interests in puzzle that now go in the ground versus sitting off the ground? And then what is that now new relationship? It's not the one that I've been focusing on between the pieces. It's the one now that's even more important, between site and your definition of site, constructed site, old-fashioned kind of real terra firma site, whatever, and this new thing on top of it. And it's going to develop the product in a very different way. You guys see that? Make sense?
Right.
I do.
What I would add to that, Tom, and I think that's right, is
from Dora.
It is that it brings up a question of to what does the site belong to? Can the site be a kind of artifact of the of the building, that it's kind of part of the building, just like the aircraft carrier, or say, the way in which that landscape in the Perot Museum, Tom, right? It belongs more to the museum in a way than it does to the city. And if that's the case, then the elaborations of that site can be contingent on what the building is doing, rather than any of its belonging to or sensitivity or whatever. The history of the discourse about context is also very much a history of a kind of finger wagging at modernism's, ambivalence to the site, right? And you're supposed to be more sensitive, and this was a way of kind of being more sensitive. And I think there's something kind of radical to say, the Rem Koolhaas, and sorry for the language here, but the YouTube fuck context, right? And this is an opportunity for the building to kind of renegotiate those terms by ownership of that site, taking it with you when you go.
Hey, by the way, that was his language. You don't have to apologize for his language.
I'm quoting, right?
Thank you, Isabel and Irv.
Hey, but before you switch, can you just click to slide 22? So, you know, we need to talk about what are the values that we want to achieve? Is it necessarily comfort, ease, serenity? How come it can't be threatening? You know, I mean, is there a standard set of values that is going to be perpetuated without revisiting and that we can all take for granted? I mean, I just find this image, it's the threatening quality, and, you know, get off of my building because I'm isolating. You can't find the door, stay out of my house. I mean, I just think we need a bigger volume of values, and that we should be able to consider to be relevant in the world today. I mean, if you know about the YouTube algorithm that produced the time watching algorithm that ended up producing the shooting in New Zealand. This was, you know, developed by Google. I mean, it was how to increase people's time watching YouTube, and the way they found out to do it is by making the material more and more edgier, more and more threatening, and, you know, less and less desirable, scarier. And so the qualities that enchant our imagination and our lives, that's what I think we should at least accept the possibility that we need to be exploring that entire data set. It's been, oh, sorry, that's tomorrow.
Yeah, real quick. I mean, I was looking online for it quickly. I exist online. I was at the sanatorium in Palo Alto's project, and there's an amazing black and white photograph that does exactly what you're talking about, Jaishree. It is like Whole Line's aircraft carrier in the cornfield. I know that Hanan has posted that in the chat, but it's basically a historic photograph of that project towering above the Finnish landscape and the forest. And it inspires both of the things you're talking about, like probably an imminent fear that you've now been enrolled in that institution, which seems so foreign and in such high contrast to the landscape, let's say. But then also the very possible scenario where it's like, oh, thank God I'm getting to go into that institution, right? Because that institution, it will likely medically save me. And that image is that image, which I'd never seen before, but it's hanging in the basement of that building, not basement.
Where is that?
Which
one is that you're talking about?
The Paimio, the sanatorium in Paimio. Alto's institution, where he thins it out and explodes it, in a sense, creates an analogous complexity to the figural quality of the architecture. And he does so off of, you know, this, in a sense, like health and sanitation savior through
all those
architecture.
Tuberculosis hospitals.
Yeah.
Dwayne, I know we have to move on.
Yep.
But a quick thing in relation to this particular project, it may come up in other projects, but since we have this one, which I find incredibly provocative, one thing occurred to me in the conversation that I think Jeff has pointed out and Jason just mentioned is, and I think it may be because we are all being trapped in the medium that we are looking at the work. I think we will be looking into physical models in personally different feeling. But since the mediation that we're going through images on the screen every time, in projects like this and other one, there's an interesting idea of literality to explore, in which your building should look exactly like your model. Like, I imagine that your project will be all black, everything like that, and it will be an extreme act of artificiality. So I wonder, because again, the mediation that we're going through, in which images are real or constructed realities, is all the same right now. I think it's an interesting angle to think about many of these projects, to start to take it at face value what they are. At least I'm looking at that, and we were looking at the one that they were mentioning about the aircraft. I think there is a fascinating possibility too, in which the different stages that the project will go, we can really embrace and collapse in them and take them for what they are. And again, I'm not saying that you guys were thinking of that, but there is something for me fascinating about being looking at the project in this way, which to me, it triggers a different way how we can start to think about it and how you can start talking about it, at least even for the time being. But it may be that there is a rupture here that move forward and we can start to embrace that possibility.
Yeah, agree.
Thank you so much.
Well,
Appreciate it.
thank you, Irv.
Thank you.
So we are at the hour and a half mark, and we've gotten through 2. So we have to get through 4 in the same amount of time.
Well, that's okay. I'm leaving soon. You got all the time you need.
So yeah, I'm going to get more insistent on moving quickly.
So John Enright, is that a photograph behind you?
No, I'm in a pickup truck on Santa Fe.
You look like you're in a blue screen.
Yeah.
Okay, go ahead,
Yeah,
Dwayne. Go ahead.
Sorry, Eong and Hao, it's all yours.
All right, let me share the screen for you.
Hey, Mariana.
Jeffrey, lower your camera. We got just
Lower
your
my
glasses.
Is that better? I can't see any. Can you see me now?
They move my camera. Yes, yes. Good.
Okay.
All right, Hao and Eong, go.
Okay. Hi, everyone. My name is Yang.
My name is Hojo.
So the project name is Hanayama Square, Puzzling Forms of Assemble. The first part is the introduction of Hanayama Square. This puzzle is made from 2 types of pieces, each with a pin set inside that moves in or out by tilting and or applying a little bit of force to the puzzles. The pieces also has grooves, which differ in shape depending on whether they are gold or silver pieces. So once you get the puzzles, there are 2 sets of grooves, gold one and silver ones, with the logo Hanayama Square on it. Slide it horizontally, it will be locked. It not be disassembled. But once you place it vertically, slightly apply a little force on the corner, it will be assembled. So the pin engaging the silver pieces will move freely into the grooves, while the pin engaging the gold piece will be blocked in the grooves and prevented from moving freely. So that is the individual part of the gold one, and this is the silver ones. They all have a pin system inside it. Slightly shake it, it will be slide out. And once you slide it back, it can be slide freely together if you play it vertically. But once you play it horizontally or just shake it, let the pin slide out, the slide motion will be blocked. That will be the difficult part of this puzzle. So come to the second part, the 3D puzzle, the core. The modified 3D puzzle took the patterns from original Hanayama Square, then developed it into a vertical way by stacking the similar sets of groups on top of each other to form in occlusion systems, which create a much more 3D geometries, which become the base form to be modified later. Assemble of 2 sets of pieces requires rotation and perfect alignment of stacking clouds. Once you get our puzzles, put it horizontally on the table, catch 2 pieces, slide it and rotate alignment perfectly, the puzzle is solved. Also, the logic to put it back is the same. Take all pieces, place it horizontally, align the clouds and the curves, slide them back, the puzzle is solved as well. We also look at ways to further make use of these interior occlusion parts to allow them to move deeper into the object. For example, considering the potential for the curved interior architectural spaces.
For the 2D puzzle, this puzzle took the idea of unique 2D patterns from Hanayama Square with the method of rescaling, relocating, and rotation. The 2D direction experiment was especially useful as we moved in terms of its assembly later, which combined both the thought from 3D and 2D puzzle translations. It provides us unexpected ways to examine the potential of the assembles. So the 15 separate puzzle pieces can be placed into the base plate in any order. There is no hierarchy of them. All the pieces not only keep the visual language of the original Hanayama puzzle, but also transform into the unique 3D geometry. When you play with it, you will feel it's easy to solve that, but since it has the similar visual language, so actually it will take a long time to solve it. For the combination of the site and the building, this whole site combines the idea of the 3D and 2D puzzle pieces by blurring the boundary between them. Part of the building was embedded into the host site, and the part of the site works as the building. We believe both the 2D and the 3D puzzle already suggest a series of pieces waiting to be assembled to form an entity once it has been rescaled, refigured, and rotated. The building parts have mainly been developed from 3D puzzle by stretching the silver grooves into horizontal direction, which organically improved the flexibility of geometry and produced above typology architecture features. And for the detail, it has the same language and the strategy as our building, but it's in a very small scale. So for the detail, we are trying to introduce a new interpretation by introducing the new language of our original puzzle, which is a straight line of our puzzles. We transfer this corner geometry into a staircase. The funny thing is that we are trying to create a misreading of a mechanical movement to the stair. The wall and the stair steps have the same language, which means that the wall has enough tolerance to hold up the stair and fold it up to the wall. And the scratch moment on the material also is a hint for that. But in fact, the stair cannot be held up. It's a misreading moment.
So now we come to the final step, which is the developing the host site and 3D massing into realistic projects. The combination method we used in site development was very useful. By blurring the boundary between site and building, we created a weird connection between them. Now we are trying to perform the assemble methodology that we got from those puzzle experiments and create the simultaneous install process of this project. The movement of the site took the assemble logic from Hanayama puzzle, using rotation to move different blocks into the right position. And the side pieces around our museum could be divided into 4 pieces, just like the Hanayama puzzle, using the same patterns that we developed in both 2D and 3D modified puzzles. Overall, the entire assemble process happens simultaneously. Each building part has their specific attach point to the side block. All building parts will get together at the end of the assemble process. Now come to the section model. The first thing when we transfer to real project design is rearrange the interior space. In our case, we took the advantage of occlusion systems that we developed before in the 3D puzzle experiment and use it as the generator of slabs and the tilt walls inside. In order to divide the interior spaces, we use the gaps between different massing blocks that form the skylight to separate the gallery spaces, which are also being used later for different museum program use. In addition, the occlusion concept is used to generate various public space and semi-open space due to its staking logic and a different height relation to each floor. For example, on the right side, the space beneath the auditorium space was organized according to the space position of the clouds from occlusion systems. Also, the attach point of different clouds naturally provided the access and the circulation between different blocks.
Last but not least, the site took the idea of rotation and slide to catch the building during the assemble process. Look at the left bottom part. The building part was extended into the site area, which leads to the from its assemble. Also, the site work as part of the building, not just landscape.
At the final part, we provide a video showing all the processes that we've been through during our designs, the puzzling world.
The devil.
Thank you so much. That will be the end of our presentation.
Jeff, did you capture all those Westworld references?
Yeah, got it. Didn't you hear me laughing? I was just looking at, is the Hanayama square puzzle one you bought? So is that, this is a found object. This is the way it comes.
Yes, the flattened version. So their interpretation immediately three-dimensionalized it into the sort of, the first iteration was the round ball.
Okay, so those shapes, those are those, but go back, I'm just interested, I mean, those are beautiful two-dimensional shapes in the puzzle itself, but do they say something in Japanese? Or, I mean, just the image of the puzzle itself. Like, so those forms in the puzzle are different than the other form. Just the puzzle itself is quite different. So the organic shapes that are in the interlocking puzzle there, that are highlighted in the silver. The one on the left looks like a laughing figure, and the one on you see it? So where do those shapes have any content? I'm just curious about that. I mean, the Yi Yang, do you know?
Oh yeah, we're kind of curious why the shape is like that, because the entire logic of these puzzles is about the rotation, and it has to set two kind of axes in the puzzles. So
I understand about how the puzzle works. I'm asking you specifically about the design of this specific puzzle.
Well, the patterns, I think, is generated from the rotation patterns. It has to follow the path it rotates.
I
So
see.
it kind of.
I see. So those are an index of the rotation pattern.
Yeah.
Okay, and then you have a video of that. Do you have that or not? a video of you opening the puzzle? Yeah. I guess, you know, I'm soon to leave, and so I just wanted to add one more thing. The thing about this puzzle, and you know, it seems to perform differently than the other puzzles. It was odd how it fell apart in your hand. I'm even more intrigued because the solid void relationships are they have a kind of yin yang quality, but they're also quite organic. And yet what happens in your, so if you go to puzzle, if you go to your slide number 8, when you start to interpret the puzzle, you appropriate the puzzle elements in a way which diminishes both their behaviors and their formal idiosyncrasy. You multiply them. Now, this is the way a Western architect would produce a high-rise building. Do you understand what I'm saying?
Yeah.
Okay. And so remember, this is a class, so I'm just trying to be as teaching as I possibly can. So that instinct is not uninteresting for an architect, but you need to understand that the most interesting two features, which are the formal idiosyncrasies of this particular puzzle element and its odd behavior, the fact that its shape is not a shape that has meaning, but a shape that indexes its actual behavior. The minute you start to do this stacking, you erase both of those. You increase the degree to which they become repetitive in a banal way, and you decrease the degree to which its relationship to any performance at all. And then if you go now to step 9, okay, so I skipped one step 2. So if you go back, from this point on anyway, what you have to do is start to try to invent ways to make it interesting again. So you repeat things that I see happen in every level, from students all the way up to professional architects. And that is you put yourself in a bit of a bind, but then you do smart things. So, I mean, can you back up just one slide? Okay, so you go from there, you go to the next slide. Okay, so if you look at the puzzles on the right, you're basically struggling to figure out how to get that stack to be interesting again, and you do nice things. You feather the feet, you rotate it so that you get anamorphic or biological performances. And then go to the next slide, and then you invent this performance at 10 and 11. You start to invent these performances. So play that. Okay, but so that performance is basically an uncaging of the orb. So you have a shaped cage, which is now trapping. I hate to say this, but that's very much how an encapsulated virus works. So that it's not a bad model of the coronavirus. So play it one more time. So the outside is the capsule, and the inside, the red. So we have the capsule. But what's particularly interesting now is all the interesting features. So this now, to my eye, looks like an old V8 engine taken apart. So I guess my point is, if you start with a very interesting heuristic device, but your instincts of what to do with it put you into an architectural position because you have architectural instincts that are good, but not working well with your heuristic device. So if I'm just going to finish using the language I'm using, a heuristic device is supposed to dislodge your architectural instincts. You're not supposed to you're not supposed to subordinate the heuristic device, which was that Hanayama square, and make it submit to your architectural instincts. But by the time you're here, you've done just the opposite. You've used all the features that could be found in that tile, like the feet. You've turned the feet into a cage, and you've turned everything about it. You've turned into something, a very familiar architectural, organization in 3 dimensions. It's a stacked form with a core in the middle. And by that point in time, all you can do is work that problem out. So I think it's not so much that I'm criticizing you or that what I want you to do is understand what happened. Understand you saw something, you knew what to do with it, because you've done it before. And then from that point on, a kind of automatic set of steps has to happen, and there's no way to stop it. So, and that's why you end up with where you ended up with. And some of the most interesting features of your starting condition, which puts you I think, in the most, you had the best cards of anyone that was dealt, and you ended up losing the pot because, your very well trained architectural instincts took over when they shouldn't. So that's my appreciation of this project. I'm only saying this to wrap up because I'm going to have to leave in a few minutes. But anyway, that's it. Those are my remarks.
I really liked in the previous project how when they did this video that we're looking at right here, the students actually weren't able to sort of fluidly move them across. I don't know if you noticed, there was a moment where it kind of caught and they had to kind of reorient it, and then they were able to pull it apart. Yes. This project seems like the 2 people that are pulling this apart, they kind of choreographed it. It makes it look so easy, right? And we all know when we play with these things, sometimes they're maddening. You can't actually do what they just did. It might take you 30 minutes to kind of figure out that kind of coordination.
Yeah, but when you watch this, you can't do it. Look how hard this is.
Yeah,
and it should fall apart like this.
So there's a moment where there's a moment here where it Jaishree mentioned it seems like fall apart in their hand, right? There's a moment where you sort of pull it so far apart and it becomes disassembled, and it so it seems like a little bit of a question about the process by which you have to sort of pause this. You don't want them together. You don't want them completely apart. You need certain parts to begin to just touch each other, and you need a little bit of the kind of flirtation between the sides to make this work. I wonder when we go from kind of where you started to where you ended, for me, it doesn't seem like there's enough. I think Dwayne mentioned this idea of kind of misfit and misdirection, and there's a kind of magic to these things. It feels like the final product of this lacks a little bit of that quality of the uncertainty of actually working with these things. It seems like it's too fluid, and maybe that's what Jaishree is saying, is that you sort of, your instincts to be kind of architects and have the pieces kind of fit together in a somewhat rational fashion kind of took over. But for me, I wish that there was a little bit more misfit in the final, a little bit more mystery in the final, kind of version of this. It almost seems to fit too well together in the end, for me.
I do think those are both fair comments, and especially that issue of stacking and rotating in is especially noticeable in the earlier piece. When you look at the section, it's almost unrecognizable though, the sense of stacking. I do think that there was a translation as they moved into building to sort of break down that rather, simplistic form of stacking. And in a way, this is the one of those that we've seen where, as simple as the movement is in this thing, it's you don't get a sense. If I look at this thing,
I see what you mean.
Apart.
I think you're right. I see exactly what you mean. So take us around that model a little bit. And the section, and let us see that. Yeah, maybe we didn't pay it. And show us the section drawings. Yeah, this is just a different project. You're not fooling us. No, I think you're right. I see.
Yeah, clearly, I think that the best part of that is that it turns into this kind of leaning tower, pushed up against the other.
Kissing.
And and it's got a lot of potential in that, in that. And I'm gonna just throw something out that I think is, I think I agree with the comments. I think you took advantage of the flat part rather than the shapely part of the puzzle, and that was your sort of mistake, right? It was like, oh, just flat. If you got a flat thing, it can stack, right? And so I agree with the comments, but I'm intrigued by it. Looks like a V8 engine specifically, right? It looks like a motorcycle engine or something like that, and therefore there's something fascinating to me about the parts as being the products of a kind of machined environment, specifically that they would be traditionally milled with a CNC, mill. And so there, you get this idea that each of these could be like CNC milled, and then existing as these kind of non-platonic solids that are supposed to then fit together, as the case may be, then pull apart usually like that, like they just kind of explode, in your hand, as you quote disassemble them. But that the CNC mill in the tradition of, say, architectural thinking over the last 30, 40 years has been used as a device for creating a site topos. And I'm wondering if there wouldn't be an interesting potential that could also be explored in terms of thinking about the role of the computer numerical, modeling, so to speak, that comes from the CNC that can afford a very different. This is not just a site machine, and it's not just a solid machine, but something in between that can maybe get at some of the questions that we've also been bringing up about the difference between the site and the building, which don't really also get tackled in this project. Like this project still seems to be a kind of solitary building, say, without a lot of site. Can you go down to the very end? This doesn't seem to have a lot of sightliness. Yeah. Although I do like that lane. I like the leaning tower piece on it.
Yeah, maybe I wanted to talk about the leaning tower because I think there is something very interesting and perhaps done in a subtle way in the project. Like the strategy for the exterior made me think of the Lloyd's Bank in London. And then you had a slide that was just that one slide of a detail where you show the relationship between an internal facade and a stair. Can you go back to that one? Yes, yes, this one, these two. And I thought that it was quite beautiful to see how something that was very two-dimensional in the sense of using extrusion as the primary operation for generating 3D. Here you were beginning to produce more three-dimensional manipulations, but still see a clear sense of sequencing. I love what you're doing to the wall and the relationship between the horizontal plane and the vertical plane. And then when you show the section on the leaning tower, I also liked in the puzzle that moment where the whole piece goes from, in 1 second, from being very robust to being incredibly precarious. And for me, that operation of tilting that entire tower, it made it feel really precarious. Like you have something ginormous that is, you know, almost holding it structurally. So I wonder if in the kind of in the DNA of this detail is how you resolve the transitions between two different forms of order. One that organizes the exterior of the building and might be, you know, fairly easily understandable, right? Like this stacking of pieces and the kind of the CNC, the extrusion, but there's somewhere in the relationship or in the definition of the architectural elements that completely transform that order and create that one subtle twist, but create something completely different on the interior. So I don't know if you see your project that way or that's something you're reading that I'm projecting into it, but I thought that was a great moment for this project. Very beautiful, very, very delicate, but somehow it organized things that happen at a very massive scale with something that is like the detail of a stair and its relationship to the wall. I thought that was great.
Thank you.
Any final comments for them? Okay, thank you very much.
Thank you.
Thank you so much.
Thank you so much.
Now we have Evelyn and Evelyn. Hey guys.
Hi, thank you so much for having us. Okay, let me share my screen real quick. Hold on, can you close this? Can you close it?
Cool.
Yeah, can you close it? Okay, good afternoon, everyone. Thank you so much for joining us today. My name is Evelyn and I have Jaishree and An-Say with me as well. The theme of the original Hanayama puzzle is log, and the puzzle solution is the result of tricks not visible at first impression. The outer rings need to be perfectly aligned for the pieces to slide into the inner tracks. As you resolve the puzzle, these interior pieces will reveal themselves, which are really the most interesting aspect of the puzzle and how they fit into each other. The solution is not necessarily intuitive and it follows a specific step of interaction for its assembly and disassembly, rotating and sliding and following a track. The two outer rings have a regular shape and do not provide any clue on how to resolve the puzzle.
We quickly realized that the design of the exterior rings does not impact the solution of the puzzle, so we went a little while. We look at the same complexity of the original puzzle and we developed these clues for its assembly. The trick was to perfectly align the inner tracks while the recreation of the 3D puzzle might look more complicated. We found an opportunity to add clues that help us resolve the puzzle. The white small extruded pieces play this role. They relate directly to the inner tracks. In doing so, we brought the solution held on the inside to the outer shell.
We translated the logic used on the original Hanayama puzzle of rotating and sliding and following a track to recreate our 3D puzzle and design our 2D puzzle. The 2D puzzle base is a puzzle itself. Its design is more regular to contrast the strong language of the white pieces and make it a little more playful. The white pieces are interlocked with logs hidden on the base of the puzzle. The 2D and 3D puzzles share a similar language on both their composition and solution. We develop and materialize some ideas by midterm in response to the original Hanayama puzzle.
After several studies, one aspect of the original Hanayama puzzle that wasn't explored was the element of surprise or unexpected results as you resolve it. Our detail explores a different conceptual approach. While keeping a similar formal language as the 2D and 3D puzzles, we considered another interpretation at a very different scale. As you rotate the small handle, it pushes and locks the upper bar directly, but at the same time, it pushes the central disk. rotating it and pushing the lock at the bottom. At first, it is not obvious that something else is going on. The most obvious solution is to unlock something at the top, but it is also doing something else elsewhere.
The concept of locking and revealing is translated into the site by following the same step of interaction as we mentioned before. Essentially, the mapping of this key lock is recreated, but in doing so, it creates spaces on the site, like landscape, amphitheater, galleries, and terraces. They are just interaction, but they create problematic spaces on the site. In other words, the site is the combination and a mix of thinking about steps, graphic composition, three-dimensionally, and how this works problematically. As you enter the site, it reveals small hints of the building footprint and its territory to its final location. We also reinforce the relationship to the ground and building. The building, in other words, the building action and movement of rotating, sliding, and following a track erode and transform the site along its territory. There is a balance of manipulating the site especially, but it also is something that creates an interesting fit for the assembly for the key of the site. The building is not an element of the site, but instead is only a part of the site, a larger set of parts.
The site is a combination of our 2D, 3D, and detail. It is an accurate reflection of two scales that are getting mixed up. The language and formal composition became the influential things when we designed the building. The same source produced different outcomes, and that will automatically be fused back into one and thought the design of the building. We look at ways of assembling into the site as it rotates and slides its way across the site, leaving fragments of itself along the way.
Sorry, let me start this.
The building is divided into three main structures or levels, and they are broken down in a way that they interrelate and lock themselves into each other. The small extruded pieces serve as interlocking parts to hold the building while serving and forming smaller interior spaces holding different functions. The language of the building and the spaces formed out of the void spaces from the building movement and erosion on the site reinforce the strong relationship to the ground. For these parts to work, we strictly follow a set of instructions. The three main parts need to rotate between each other, slide the interlocking pieces, and follow a track for its composition. These interlocking pieces will define our public and private spaces, housing specific functions of the program of the museum, gallery, exhibition, and underground spaces.
The details of the building and its section return to the key aspect of our early puzzle. The upper level enclosed terraces, social gathering, and special events. The special exhibition and permanent collection galleries are housed by key elements at the center of the volume. The office and administrative areas are located at a lower level for easy access. Small gallery and storage spaces are at the bottom level in three main vertical circulation.
The strong relationship to the ground gives an opportunity to develop an outdoor gallery space and sculptural garden. Looking closer into the details of the building, the shape of pieces are reflected inside and is a constant reminder while going through the interior spaces.
Our intention was to learn from the issues of a complex puzzle, translate them, and follow all the way into the design of the building. The result is reflected into this intricacy of the pieces and a set of elements to the whole relationship in a building. Thank you.
Dwayne, can I start by asking you a question? Because as the fourth project, I'm interested in maybe would be your pedagogical objectives. And that as they discussed the project in terms of galleries, etc., it occurred to me I'd never even thought about this. I'm sitting in my studio and I'm about to go into a meeting that's beginning a project, which is a gallery, which is a museum space. It's occurring to me that is there any interest, since you've given it a specificity of a particular site and a particular use, is it of any interest to you that there's an alignment? And there seems to be it hasn't been talked about, there seems to be an implicit discussion that your strategy has to do with producing organizational strategies for spatial systems and spatial types, and it seems to assume an interest in differentiation, that it produces various varieties of spatial types that you've agreed with are required for the type of program you're solving, right? And but I would ask if, because I can't talk about these in terms of gallery space or anything having to do with program, impossible, because they just show up as plans and they're architectural. There's no question, right? And they appear and they're drawn as architectural sections, and they have differentiation. They have these various characteristics that come from the initial conceptual strategy. But would it be important or interesting to make an early alignment between the particular thing you're investigating in terms of the type of spatial organization you're moving towards, or the type of, or the agreement on differentiation and the nature of that differentiation, and some alignment with any notion of intentionality in terms of that function? Because I would have said, I would have called most of these I would have called them elementary schools or high schools, and been much closer, and couldn't possibly say these are galleries, that they have nothing to do with the relationship of spaces that have to do with showing art in social terms, in functional terms, in terms that we deal with light. We could go on and on. In terms of any kind of a protocol, in terms of the spatial sequence of kind of how you move through the space. But again, I'm just asking a question, because to me, it would have to do with some very early alignment that which of these strategies are more, would you hunch or have a sense are moving you to some set of objectives having to do with the organization and the differentiation of spatial types?
Yeah, it's true. If you were to try to deal with this, particularly from the standpoint of sequence through a museum, they'd be relatively problematic. I think you could say of probably most of the studios that I have taught, if you were to do the only way to get to that kind of alignment with a program would be to say, you do this project in the way that they've done it in order to understand its potential within the 13-week semester as a way of dealing with the larger idea. You then become sort of completely saturated with what it potentially produces in terms of a set of relationships. You then redo the problem having plugging in the programmatic ideas. But now you've got a set of ideas that help to ensure you don't rely on the same kind of preconceptions about a general sequence or sort of standard way of operating. So the answer is yes, you would absolutely need to do that if this were a real project. But within the time that we have, my feeling is you get the most out of looking very specifically at the puzzles, what they offer you. But I do think it's important that the students know that if you were to redo this project, you've got to embed it with all.
It's not redoing it. I'm going to suggest that you can do this in a more schematized format, because what I've now found in the last decade is that fewer and fewer people coming out of school can make that connection between, let's say, a left and right synaptic stuff and operating within some sort of, let's again oversimplify and just discuss it as a somewhat pragmatic, a priori notion of what a function is, a museum is, versus exploration of challenging that idea through a conceptual framework, whatever it is, and making that leap. But it's precisely the early hunching of finding some schematic notion between the generalization of the pragmatics and a broader conceptualization of making that link that is the definition of an architect. I'm finding more people could do one or the other, but fewer and fewer can do both. And I'd say that's the definition of an architect. If you can't operate left, right, not wrong profession. And again, to me, it'd be important that there's at least some movement, forget even resolving it. I'm not talking about it in terms of being an architectural practitioner, but there's some broad notion of where this is taking you in terms of some spatial goal or some idea having to do with the sequencing of movement or the notion of social activity. It's put in some framework, whether it's social, cultural, political, whether it's connected to ground we talked about, that would radically kind of shift this notion. At some point, you're looking at this organization and it has to do with site, and you start moving towards that as a direction. But isn't that some basis of intentionality? Isn't that going to be useful here? Because we get to the sections and honestly, we can't talk about them. It's not fair. It's a kind of a fake architecture. They look like architecture, and they have like the one that put a stair on it. Is it number 2? I looked at the stair and went, what the fuck? That's just a stair. We know that stair. That's a conventional stair. And it's already happening. Once they touch anything that's real, they forget their idea already. And they're at this point of their education. They already forget it. Because I'm going, no, it's not that stair. You invented the stair. And it's coming in that space. It's connected to your idea. And the importance is to make the leap into this conceptual idea, which has nothing to do with architecture, until you make it. You demand that it is an architectural idea. And this is not done through some other discipline. This is done through some broad notion of what we do as architects. Anyway, again, I'm stuck here in my practice, so I have no choice. And it's just kind of what I'm doing every day. And I'm totally fascinated. And what's interesting, on the other hand, what they do, I'm looking at the model right now, they're intensely architectural in terms of their physicality and their presence in physical terms and in their discipline. They have a rigor and a discipline which is highly kind of architectural, and they have a materiality, and they're interested in assemblage. That the part of your statement clear here as we look at this, right? That there's an absolute kind of commitment to that. I'm just pushing the other one, that some broader kind of notion of how it services. You know, everybody in this group knows, nobody cares about this. This is a conversation we're having among a couple dozen people, right? It's the next half that you're going to make the connection with. Kind of how does it service, in what way does this service advance us in any kind of terms you want to talk about? And it seems that there has to be some element of that I'm convinced E and Evelyn can do. I'm just asking a question. I don't know the answer to this. It is a question mark.
Yes, there is. Whenever we, and yes, what Dwayne said, we, of course, the next step for this has been to like further develop the program. And we had gone back and forward between, you know, what is the relationship to like how the site is forming, what is the design of the building, taking into consideration the early issues of the puzzle, but then how do we link this to the program, right? Because it's not like, okay, you have this space, like, okay, what should we do with this space? And just name something just a bit, right? That's not the point. So whenever in our section, what we did is like, once we have the building, which is not exactly like this, but well, once we had the building before we enter into the spaces and have a feeling on what this could be, and if this has a potential to be a gallery, a special exhibition, or we look at the core of the building, okay, and to the core of the building, we can have some, like a special exhibition, okay, so what are the requirements of these spaces? And based on that, we modify the building, like opening spaces or work on the pieces a little bit more. And I know, of course, it's not a real building, it's in a conceptual way, but we also see the potential on how, what was the feeling inside these spaces, and just it's going back and forward between the design of the building and the functionality of the interior spaces.
As I'm saying this, and if I'm being overly kind of strong about it, both you and Evelyn, it's a beautiful piece of work, and you have a huge amount of talent, right? And I'm looking at this, and I'm supporting everything that you're attempting to do, right? And but I think it's not adjusting it. It's really it's something much more fundamental than that I would like you to take away from this, because I wouldn't even talk about this project. I didn't think it had huge merits, right? And I'm fighting for you, right? And I'm just asking a question of kind of when that takes place. And my hunch or my own instinct is it takes place a little earlier. That you're so, you're also like all of us, and as Duchamp made very clear in his early work, you're starting to become very attached to this thing, because I'm attached to it. And it's gone a little too far. That I'm not. That attachment is in the way of my creative movement forward. And it's transformative. It's transforming into something that is real. Real meaning that it has some threshold of connection to the real that we don't want to talk about, right? And it's precisely because I'm so attached to this that I'm having this conversation, and I get worried when it gets this far along, whether we're going to now be comfortable in saying that this is going to be transformative. Make sense?
It does. It does. Yeah, totally.
Any last comment?
I think I like the
maybe to offer a different angle from what Tom is saying, which I mean, I don't think anybody can disagree with that. There is, and this is for Yi and Evelyn, but also for Dwayne. I find I'm really fascinated by the couple of things that has emerged as patterns in the work of the studio. One is, I want to go back to what I was talking in the first one about the idea of the language of precision, which is something that I'm really intrigued by, how he managed to carry on through the whole process. So it requires a huge amount of rigor to understand the jumps on the scale and the origin into what the project became at the end. And I think that is an important thing to keep in mind in terms of the methodology. And I think what in relation to what Tom is saying, and I think if you articulate the notion of precision, not as an aspiration, but as a way to understand your way of working, I think those questions that Tom is posing, I think that I would not say that it's easy, but I think the methodology is flexible enough to incorporate that. The other thing that is fascinates me, and this is much more my personal obsessions with the notion of genres and how the genres evolve within the logic of methodologies. And one thing I have to say, Dwayne, one silver lining, and I think about the byproduct of the quarantine, that we were forced to work in a different way, and I think it forced your particular studio to work in a different way that traditionally within the pedagogy that you're interested in work with the students has changed. But I think it's an interesting, fascinating byproduct is the notion of the intersection of the digitalization of the mechanics of it. It's a language that came from a kind of a mechanical ensemble, but to be filtered in the way that the digital tried to incorporate the material physicality of the construction of the model process, and the way that the thing allows the understanding of the assembly and the dynamic of those assembly coming into play, that it will be way different if we will look then into models. They will have certain similarities, but it will be different. I think that opens a whole other series of possibilities in which the thing that I think Tom is mentioning, it can be incorporated in a way that it will be another layer in that language of precision, in a way that this notion of assembly, this relation to part, the whole kind of a function or programmatic thing, it can be incorporated as part of the repertoire in which it will become part of the choreography. I don't think it needs to be something that it becomes a kind of a reverse engineer later. I think if there is lessons to be learned about the situation that the work was forced to be developed, I think there is a sequential understanding of it, which I think as a genre, I think from my point of view, it has been a fantastic addition to the repertoire of the pedagogy. So I will reflect on that moving forward, because I have a feeling that many of the students, they will keep these elements that incorporate to the studio as we move forward. So there is always a kind of, for me, a super close relation between the methodological way and the way that you think about it. And you said that in your introduction, and I don't think that has been, I don't think that has been a demeanor of it. Actually, I think it has been expanded, that notion that the making and doing all integrated. And I think this is incorporated under layer. And this project, I think all the projects reflect on that in one way or another, but this one I think is particularly compelling in that relationship. There is a kind of a brutal coherency emerging from each step from one to another that I think has been enhanced by the way that this has been incorporated. So I would really encourage that as a genre understanding to work through the problem, to be incorporated as a kind of a permanent way to start to think about this. I really love all the projects, and I love this one, and the way the precision in terms of all the multiplicity of the curvature language is a remarkable accomplishment. And again, I know sometimes in reviews we tend not to talk about those things so explicitly, but the way that you manage the whole curvature language in the way that the fluidity that navigate from one stage to another, I would say that that's a major accomplishment. And I think you guys should really reflect on that and look into that. So I think there is a phenomenal opportunity there in how this the project with capital P is being enhanced by this.
Thank you for that, Hernan.
Thank you.
Okay, thank you, Evelyn and Evelyn.
Thank you, Dwayne.
Thank you.
Bye.
So, Blake, Leo, and Victoria, it's all yours. So we have two more. We're going to have a hard time making it at by 2 o'clock. So I hope we can get a few more minutes out of.
Yeah, Wayne, I have a point. I'll be gone just before 2. I can't help it. Okay.
Sure.
Okay. Hi, my name is Blake.
Hi, I'm Leo.
And there's also Victoria.
Hi, I'm Victoria.
We began this semester by interpreting the core characteristics of the diamond Hamayama puzzle. The puzzle is a level 1 puzzle, which utilizes geometry to drive the ambiguity of the puzzle. And upon completion of the puzzle, it leads to concisely evident that it's completed. This is a result of the rotational axis that has driven the geometry, which leads to duality of materials and then the pattern on the surface. And we took this idea and transformed it into a larger puzzle by conceptually stacking 2 of them together and then introducing a new form in which, or connection type in the middle, which connects them together. And as shown here, we can see the disassembly of these pieces. We started to look at carving the form and making each piece unique, as in the diamond puzzle, each piece is identical. So carving and manipulating it makes more ambiguity between the pieces, and assembling becomes more difficult to assemble.
Then we moved on designing the 2D puzzle. we desire to continue the key characteristics that are important to us in 3D puzzle, the rotational assembly of pieces and the color material of duality between them. The rotational motion inspired the idea of forming the puzzle, the swirl. This condition was exaggerated, but we keep the motion simple with just one rotational twist. The irregular form also echoes back to the puzzle that the motion can only work one way and needs to have the perfect alignment. As you can see, the difference between the material. In terms of materiality, the cold tone granite contrasts with the warm tone of the wood. The organic ribble surface contrasts with the cubic geometry. This was especially helpful as we moved on relating it to architecture design. We wanted to start thinking about the design of the small details in the building, because both puzzles and the details are human scale that can reachable and can be interact with buildings. We're interested in building features, bringing features from both 2D and 3D puzzles into the details. By taking the organic form and the material contrast, we designed it to a touchable door handle and handrail. This helps us to form a better understanding on how to develop the building space in the next step.
This is a continuation of our library of handrail details. They are extruding objects that create tension between the intersecting parts. This composition can also be translated into a ground condition, depending on its position. This model scale has dimensions that allow for these projects and these objects to have the function of a door handle.
And into manipulation of site and formulation of site. We looked at the site as introducing levels of connections and the idea of ambiguity between the pieces of how they intersect and interpolate into one of each other. And we wanted to keep the buildings to have the same connection between the ground and how it's connected throughout the puzzle. So they have the same level of rotation, and then their impacts to the ground have been exaggerated to furthermore explain the puzzle. And then we have a hierarchy of paths in order of how you approach the buildings throughout the site.
So this element explores the relationship between the ground condition and the occupiable space. It shows the interior organization of one of the proposed buildings as it connects to the underground program. Its process of assembly relies on pieces or objects that fit intersecting each other.
After the site, we shift to the sectional model. The sense of assembly is also reflected in the formation of it. The idea of interlocking the puzzle and the confusing feelings help us to create the interior space. The variation of material breaks the space, but also forms them. Floor slab and wall interact just like how the building interact and connect with the site elements. This is the same kind of characteristic of the original Hanayama puzzles. Back to the idea that every element has a relationship and is a part of the larger set. The material strategy of the model also suggests a sense of contrast and a sensibility, as you can see from the layering of the assembly from the animation.
That would conclude our presentation.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Did you go to the section? The first section you showed, it's 25.
25, yeah.
Yeah, it's interesting. To continue the conversation I was having earlier, to me, this should be an example of a place that you would start looking at the relationship between your conceptual idea and very clear organizational kind of structure that's coming out of this on multiple levels. And it happening, let's say, at two different levels, the objects that start organizing the whole complex just about as a campus, and then within the objects, another set of organizations. And then maybe you showed one just before this where it showed up a stair or oh, that's very nice. Now stay with that's okay. Stay with that one. There was one that showed a stair.
Oh, this one.
More detail of one or something, and I was going, oh, that's interesting. Because at this, go back to the section. Because now at this level, and again, I'm saying this because I'm finding you guys, as you show up in the studio, you finalize this and it seems impossible to change it. It's fixed now. And you don't see it as a dynamic in process kind of entity, as an idea. And I'm looking at this guy, and this is the point you would start making the first connection or some connection very literally between the aspirations of the project within its relationship to a museum. Because you can now add pieces, subtract pieces, make them larger, make them smaller. And it's the beginning of the proof of your conceptual strategy that has the malleability, the flexibility to solve problems or to solve this particular problem on this particular site, right? And it's this place. And then with that, you realize, oh, I need sloping surfaces for a theater. And I need something that's a stair, or I need certain types of spaces that say that given this language, there's certain parts of the language which you immediately are starting making connections to that you could advance or subtract or manipulate, right? Because you have a very open system in formal terms, right? In an abstract sense. And this is where you start making the alignment, right? At this point, and because you can make huge changes, because I would have said, looking at this one again now, if we'd have had a conversation with ground or site, like we had in some of the further ones, I would think we could now go to work on this in terms of the relationship of the ground and the building and this thing in between, and there'd be a conversation. And it's completely open for all kinds of options still, right? And it's absolutely malleable. And that'd be one conversation. We have another one discussing the relationship of the numbers of pieces that make up now a campus of a museum, and not a single building, but a multiplicity building. And again, totally open. And you've got, it's more strategic than it is a singular design, right? You've developed a formal strategy for the problem. And today that's absolutely necessary, because stuff's going to appear and disappear and change, et cetera. And you have to have something that has that flexibility. And you have it here. Go back to more abstract. From the outside, maybe. Yeah, that one. Oh, it's fantastic. I mean, it's a beautiful, beautiful scheme. It's in. We could just about script it. There's actually ways of looking at this, but there's any number of these that are going to work, right? This isn't, you have no, my guess is, I know it's been talked about, you have no interest in ideal to start with, right? That you understand that there's any number of options and there's no such thing as ideal to start with within your system of thinking. And because of that, it leaves you even freer, right? To allow this to accommodate now whatever the issues that you put forward to make this thing into something that does make that connection. And it has nothing to do with giving up to status quo at all. Quite the opposite. You're going to be very aggressive, right? And you're going to really challenge it and move it and kind of prove it through this, because you can make these connections. Yeah. It is a beautiful, beautiful piece of.
I was going to say that the slide 23 for me is yeah, it's an incredible project at that moment where we don't yet have a kind of a reading of the interior, and I think Blake said something that I've been kind of waiting for, which is like these forms slide along the ground, and then there's a kind of exaggeration of the kind of formation, and so when you're dragging something, it gets kind of enlarged and amplified. So I think that's pretty incredible. When you go from 23 to 25, so if you go to 25, I felt a little bit like I was sort of tricked or something. There's almost not enough difference between the wood parts and plaster, the concrete parts in this. I mean, the underbelly of the building, it feels right? It's compartmentalized. It's of the ground. It's deep. It's thick. It's heavy. It's made out of heavy materials. So I was actually really surprised when I was looking at the wooden parts and the open parts, because they're even more compartmentalized than the heavy parts. And I don't know whether I love that or I hate that, but I felt betrayed a little bit when I got to this section. There's certain moments here that I think are really extraordinary when there is a sort of an inflection in the wood. There's certain moments where you're kind of slicing the wood, and you're kind of pushing and pulling the wood, that I find really exciting. Like on the far right slide, there's a kind of an inflection. There's been a kind of violence to the envelope. And I really get excited when I start seeing that. And I think that's where you sort of, you really started to get into the kind of interior logics of the spaces, and you didn't try and compartmentalize. So that one on the far right, I don't know what it's so small. It could be like an admin office or something, or maybe it's a really great library of a collection or something. But I wish that logic started to kind of permeate the project a little bit. And it is a massive building, but I just wonder whether some of these interiors couldn't be incredible and lightweight and actually made out of wood framing. You can imagine these really lightweight kind of wood frame kind of parts that almost would feel like they can float off, like a puzzle piece would kind of float off, like your videos are so light and airy. But when you get to this, it seems kind of heavy. I'll leave it at that for now.
No, I think it's interesting, again, maybe for Dwayne to react to, but you choose the kind of proof of concept comes through a section rather than a plan. I don't think I've seen one plan yet today. And so when Tom Main brings up things like utility or, which I totally agree with, his comments of always, let's say, encouraging students to close that gap from the abstract to, let's call it the real or the problem solving. I think, Dwayne, you have to take that on because you set up the brief. So you either challenge in that way or you don't because you set up the rules. But I find it interesting that the section is the drawing that's like, and I'm looking at this and thinking, oh yeah, this is a real thing now. It has floors and it has, a little bit of articulation. This one's a little strange because it's like, looks like there's two different scales going on, as I think Jason was just saying. But then it's just left there. So there's no real challenge, programmatic, circulation. There's so many things left unsolved because you're only doing it through one drawing, you're not being asked to say, well, which one of these chunks is administration, which one is a gallery, which one is a theater. It's more like improv, like you're faced with this form and then you start to articulate it like, oh, and like every time I see a sloped surface, it turns into a theater, for instance, in everybody's project, which, okay, makes sense because, you don't want to kill it with a floor plate, but you start to see these kind of similar things coming about as if, well, the thing itself will tell us where things should be based on its form and its shape. It's less of criticism, but just an interesting note that you would only use section as the way to articulate it into the next level of architecture.
I don't disagree. Time is a bitch, It's a very fair comment. And I think, I'm thinking about my comment earlier about redoing it. And I really agree with that point that I think Hernan was making and Tom was making, that it's really about when is the right time. And I'm imagining when that time was, given the pace of things, probably a couple weeks ago. So where would we be now had we stopped and recalibrated? Would the work be as interesting? I don't know. I'm not so sure it would be. But we did have the ability to take into account those things more and calibrate them more. But it's not going to get to the level of architectural development that would see how these things might play out in a more, in a way that, for example, would prevent large volumes from simply having floor plates within them, rather than thinking about the kind of compartmentalization and component nature on a smaller scale. So overall, I completely agree with the comment. It would have come with sacrifices in the time that we have.
Right. I have to leave. Hey, beautiful, Dwayne, beautiful work.
Thank you.
Our class. Really, really lovely work.
Thank you, Tom.
Okay, see you guys.
See you. Okay, we have one more group. Is everybody available for one more? Thank you, thank you, thank you. Thank you, Blake, Victoria, Leo.
Thank you, guys.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Nice work.
Bye.
Thank you.
So Antonio and Nick, it's all
Hello.
you.
Okay. I'm going to share the screen. Okay, from the beginning of the semester, we were interested in the part-to-whole relationships of a puzzle and started our investigation by focusing on Hanayama's cast metal puzzle, here shown in plastic, called the Spiral. So where the names of the other puzzles you saw earlier may not be so literal, in this case, Spiral is the biggest hint in regards to solving the puzzle itself. By finding this key piece and allowing the rest to fall down in a spiral, you're able to separate the puzzle into one group of 2 pieces and another of 3, by lifting and rotating them inwards until you get the clearance needed between these kinds of tapering lips that each one has. And this is what allows the groups to separate. From here, each piece can be easily moved. So we chose this one in particular because of its simplicity, as we thought this was a good challenge for us because we would have to transform and reinterpret the puzzle in a way that would disrupt its symmetrical nature and its overall form while still holding on to its functionality. So as we started to play around with it, we realized a couple of things. The most important to us being that the geometry of each individual piece was not as important as the geometry of the whole puzzle itself. So it wasn't necessary for each piece to be identical, but they had to at least come back together into a kind of complete shape and a shape that had a rather clear central axis. So in order to tackle this, we decided to give the puzzle an entirely new reading by superimposing a different one, the Hanayama square, onto the circle and completely remodeling each piece so that no 2 were the same. And to take this a step further, we took each piece's figure in plan view and projected that profile through itself, as we thought this would help us create more ambiguous forms and misleading seams throughout the new square, and also to allow for the introduction of a secondary element that would be rendered in a new material later on. Finally, for our transformation, we introduced a simple locking key that would increase the difficulty of the puzzle while taking advantage of these seams we'd created. All in all, creating an entirely new challenge, the Hanayama Spiral plus Square, and an entirely new catalog of parts to work with.
The materials we were interested in investigating for the project were copper and marble. The reason for this was we wanted to explore materials with a strong contrast in nature. So this led us to a choice of material that is typically associated with a subtractive process, such as a carving or chiseling, hence the marble. And this would stand in stark opposition to material that is typically pressed or bent in order to manipulate it and shape it, hence the copper. Later on, in dealing with the programmatic demands of a museum, we felt these materials pose different challenges to us in terms of creating space. So on the one hand, we dealt with a rather surface-oriented strategy with the copper, and on the other hand, in regards to the marble, it required breaking up its shear mass in order to create volume throughout negative space. Having modeled the 3-dimensional puzzle, we wanted to move into a 2-dimensional space and flatten the puzzle completely. In order to do so, we took an oblique view and completely disassembled the puzzle into components to create a field of objects. We then applied a graphic hatch to distinguish the top sides, allowing a visual representation of 3-dimensionality, enhancing the idea of 3-dimensioning into the puzzle. We used the bottom half of the puzzle pieces to create a gradient of extrusion to flatness, as well as a transverse gradient of 3D voids from top to bottom.
to take a step back from this kind of multiplicity of objects that we've taken on before, and instead focus intensely on one object from our catalog and how it might highlight an important aspect of the 3D puzzle. So to us, these were the lips or the ledges on each piece that would prevent you from fully removing it from the rest. We chose figure 19 from the list because to us, it was the one that had moved further away from the typical jigsaw form, and its hybrid of curves and straight edges suggested that it would be something comfortable to interact with. In our detail for a handrail, we started to explore how it might, in some cases, start to embed itself within the monolithic marble masses and create an interesting lip where this transition of materials would happen. We imagined the singular mass of marble would play out this dynamic transformation of whole to part or part to whole as you interacted with it on your way down the flight of stairs or up. So this progression of descending or climbing would result in you seeing and feeling the entirety of the marble at one moment, and then our manufactured parts of that whole in the others. We felt like this provided an interesting binary of a smooth mass on one hand versus an assembly of parts on the other, giving you a difference in tactility as well as its overall visual composition.
The site was split into using 3 key factors that we liked from the puzzle, such as a slight rotation between pieces to lock together, a small locking piece that disrupts the seam of pieces, and use of a slight offset that restricts the piece from going past its intended area. Apart from assembly, our approach to deal with the site was to generate a new topography by projecting the 2D puzzle onto the site. Where the puzzle had 3-dimensional pieces, it would lead to a subtraction, while terraforming was created by using a different large piece placed on the voids of the subtractions. To begin with the massing iterations, we chose pieces from the puzzle that resembled this typical jigsaw appearance and had a unique form. Placing the massing into the site was done through a series of operations similar to the puzzle in terms of rotations, tilt, and sequencing. Using this form of insertion allowed for more manipulation to be done to the site that would only be seen in the section.
So as we began to look towards the interior of the museum, we wanted the volumes of spaces to operate in a similar way to our transformed puzzle. So here you can start to see this process produced a number of spatial conditions that we thought were interesting and tied us back to characteristics we found in our earlier puzzle. For instance, you can see these protruding ledges that suggest interlocking yet misaligned pieces, while also taking advantage of the spiraling geometry of the 3D puzzle to act as our new form of circulation between these interstitial spaces. As you move from the top of the site to the bottom, 4 new pieces are introduced to tie together both the museum's massing and the site it rests on. So these begin to carve out areas of the two while resting within these new voids in a way to suggest their interlocking nature in section. Carve-outs and misfit alignments ultimately allowed for us to plug in our circulation and program while keeping the characteristics of each of the individual parts to the whole, this time translated to the scale of a building. The same sense of assembly is apparent in the formation of the section. So rather than thinking of it as a single volumetric element filled with programmatic chunks, the idea is more a set of interlocked building components that rely on the same kind of qualities we saw in the original puzzle. The sectional pieces are meant to suggest a sense of assembly. So we wanted to display the different kinetics of our puzzle in the physical model, where you might have pieces that wrap around one another in some cases, rotate and revolve into place, or simply slide into their final locking position. Here you can see a large central atrium that serves to bring light into programs down below and to the sides, as well as acting as the kind of lattice onto which other spaces grow onto, distinguishing one program from another, and subsequently the more public areas of galleries, lobbies, and kids areas to the left, from the more private spaces of offices, archive, and theater to the right. From this view, our large theater on the right finds itself tucked neatly into the ground, resting entirely below grade and using the natural buffer of earth to help control its conditions within. Meanwhile, offices and an observatory rise higher up and utilize glass curtain walls to allow for privileged vantage points, as well as the natural daylight that comes with its elevation.
Details of the building return to many of the key aspects of the puzzles, drawing on the range of translations found in the original design.
So in the original design, our 5 pieces will all unlock and open in a way that spiraled down, starting from the top one with the key piece. For our staircase, this time, instead of focusing on the ledges that prevented each piece from being removed, we decided to turn our attention to the seams in between pieces that came out of a simple issue of tolerance, and explored how that tolerance would become a physical object now with which you would interact with and rely on. In this way, something that was used purely for the fabrication of a more smoothly operating puzzle was kept invisible, was now materialized, and something tangible that came out of this small detail. So our overall intention for the semester wasn't to create so much a sense of a complexity for complexity's sake, but rather to ask whether or not the intricacy inherent in the puzzle is precisely the kind that creates a set of interesting part-to-whole relationships in a building. The result is a set of unexpected sequences, strange adjacencies, and a sense of spatial wonder at every scale. That concludes our presentation.
I wanted to say something about that stair that you just showed, which is really amazing to me. And I was looking today, I guess, I know a few students, you went to a detail, which we know Dwayne's studios and some of his other seminars which focus on that. But I've been looking, I guess, for intermediate scale work, which goes beyond maybe the site planning and the massing of the building, but then isn't quite detail like a handrail. And this is one of those in-between scales where the technique, if it is, or the mindset of the studio works really well. Like the idea of circulating through these volumes that appear like they fit together in an interesting way. It just makes this, I don't know, it seems to me, this is what the studio aspires to in the sense of this technique being able to be scaled, like not only outside massing, but to get interiors to, this also could have materiality, like you were mentioning, the kind of copper and marble, I think in the beginning. That I think, and I want to clarify my comment before about the section drawing or lack of plans. I was less a critique. I think it's fine not to have those kind of drawings. But I think this is maybe a key something here, because there is utility in this. You have to have movement, you need landings, you need stairs, etc. But it doesn't, it successfully absorbs the intent of, let's say, the puzzle and its formal aspects, and still does its job as a machine for moving. So to me, those sections, plans, whatever, program, material, structure, whatever outside force you want to put on the project to see if it's resolved or not, or becoming architecture, there's a multitude of ways. And so it's not just about, you don't have plans. To me, it's about a mindset, and like the students in this case being able to kind of proof of concept in novel ways. So I'm all for this, and it's amazing what you did here.
Thank you.
Yeah, just building on that, and I the slide that's up, that I think it's incredible. I think this is a really strong project. It's too bad that Tom wasn't able to see this project. I think it would be a project that he probably would have appreciated. All of your attention to the seams and the reveals and these things that you're doing, but also not merely just for tectonics. I love that the misfit carve out seam, you called it was related to tolerance. But it's a kind of a fault line, let's say, that runs across the project and just finds its way through the stair. I think is pretty extraordinary, and it kind of exemplifies, I think, a lot of the sensibilities that we've seen today. I also would just build on what John said about the idea of this kind of utility moment. The stair is, I don't know if your stair is utilitarian. I actually like that it kind of isn't on many levels. I think your stair Tom kept saying something about like social and functional models were kind of lacking in a lot of the projects. And I see your stair as like a sort of ultra moment where it all comes together and these complex, interlocking and interactions, kind of anti-coronavirus, kind of socialization of movement and program could become something you kind of build from. I almost wonder whether the project would start with this slide and then you work your way out and you begin to kind of build the project around the stair as a kind of a detail. And the other thing that I really appreciate is your again, the kind of seaming and the materiality and the observation about difference between marble and copper and these kinds of things and how they play out, I think in the project are pretty incredible. I do wish that some of the animations, I love the model that you ended up with where there were these different materials. And I actually don't even know, is that a real model? Is that a physical model? It doesn't even matter. I don't want to have the conversation, but I love that, you know, like you've made some like super materials in these models that I don't even know if they're real. I want them to be real. They're kind of science fiction. I guess these are sort of patinaed copper. I don't know. I don't even know if that's a rendering or whatever I'm looking at, but I love the fact that you've created these kind of monstrous kind of hybrids that you'd expect when these kinds of things get put in motion together. I kind of wish a little bit more that sensibility could have, I mean, some of the spaces seem recognizable, you know, in the kind of museum genre and in the kind of auditorium genre. I almost wish that on some level the project tried to convince me that that some of these spaces that aren't recognizable as an auditorium are in fact an auditorium. But I feel like part of the studio brings up sort of an idea that you're creating kind of new forms, and there's new forms of presentation. I mean, look at us, we're doing a Zoom final architecture review. You're presenting material to us that we have no idea of its origin. And so I think that times are changing in terms of program and recognition of certain things. And I kind of wish you would just would have pushed that a little bit further in the project, because we are in strange times and you're showing us strange details, let's say. But it's a really extraordinary body of work that you guys have put together here.
I had to leave to another meeting, but I want to congratulate everybody in the studio. It's remarkable body of work. So I'm super pleased that I was able to witness it and to see it. In this project, like in others, one thing I found a remarkable thing is the ludic aspect of the logic of the methodology. The idea that something that starts as a game, as playing, and it can evolve and amount layer by layer, the complexity that translation into produce to architecture. I think it's something that we need to keep bringing back again and again into the territory in architecture. I think sometimes we confuse certain solemnity that we try to navigate. And I think the work is incredibly serious. At the same time, it's incredibly playful. And I think in this particular case, I think you guys allowed yourself, and I think Jason was referring to some of that, to some kind of really out of sequencing moments. So it's important for me to understand that the difference between being coherent and being linear. And I think that your project is incredibly coherent, like many others were, but also allows us moment in which there are ruptures, there are distortions, there are mutations, that they are driven by the project itself. I think this is important because I would argue that even though the studio puts a lot of thinking into the logic of the methodology, at the same time allow rooms for those moments of unexpected transformation. So again, there is something really fascinating about the precision of the puzzle, which in a way established a kind of an interesting contradiction, because a puzzle, as complex as it may seem, is already have a predetermined end. So it's your job to figure it out how to put it back into the end that it was conceived for it, which again, the process of a project is almost the opposite, in which you start with certain assumptions of ideas and precision, but it still is embedded in kind of an unknown end. And what are the elements that you incorporate to that unknownness to become revealed? I think it's a fascinating one. So one thing I would encourage everybody is to do is to figure it out, those relationships between the two logics of the origin, what I was referring early, the notion of knowledge and the notion of imagination, and trying to extrapolate what are the mechanisms that make those connections. Because I think if you can hold into that, then it became a super interesting blueprint to work with a kind of a much larger project or what the kind of architecture that you want to do. So I really love in this particular project that you give yourself the latitude to incorporate those moments of in which kind of the project dictate the terms and it is not be bound by the methodology, but the methodology is some kind of a safety net that allow you to keep it always under control, but allowing those other moments to come into the project and find a way to redefine its own integrity. So I think in that sense, it's a it has been a remarkable studio, and I think this there are qualities that all the projects share. Anyway, I just want to congratulate everybody. It's a spectacular body of work. So you should feel very proud of it.
Thank you.
Thank you. And I had to leave. Thank you, guys.
Thank you, Hernan.
I want to
thank you all the critics for joining us and helping.
My pleasure. That's Hernan's points are. I want to add that, and again, this is a beautiful project, and I agree. I wish Tom had seen this one, and I wish Mariana had seen the catalog that was in here, because the catalog had a kind of delightful arbitrariness to it that both kind of perfectly logical and perfectly arbitrary at the same time. It's like feels like when you get an IKEA thing and it's never all going to go together. whatever's going on there is never all going to go together, and I think that was sort of my trepidation going into this review was that there would be this burden to make parts that form a whole, and that whole would be a kind of unknowable whole until you put all the parts together, and then you get this really coherent whole, which is how the puzzle operates. But instead, I think what's really quite intriguing is that in a sense what the students have done is that they've taken all of these different sort of parts, and you kind of never know what you're gonna get with them. Sometimes the part stays super solid, sometimes it gets real thin, and it's a kind of encased volume. Sometimes it's a volume that can be spliced, and and it doesn't really have a there's no ideality to any of these parts. They're not sacred parts. And I think that that's probably the best takeaway for me from the studio is that sensibility, that there's no like, oh, I can tell what's going to come down the pike just from even looking at this catalog. That predictability has been kind of eliminated from it. And it's been kind of fun to watch the sort of site model get assembled as an animation and get all fitted together and everything, because you're like, okay, now what? Okay, now what's going to happen? Okay, now what's going to happen? And it's not at all necessarily what you think. And then finally, I want to say that, yeah, I agree that stair is really amazing. And I'm trying to like figure out what it is, and maybe it's because it's neither really a solid or an assembly, it's like it's not necessarily an unpeeled orange or something like that. It speaks almost very eloquently to this discussion of, say, object ontology, of having that idea that objects can gain their own sorts of personalities, and they may not belong to one recognition group or to another. And I think that's really exciting. That's in the studio, and I think in this project in particular.
Thank you.
Thank you, gentlemen.
Thank you.
You could stop the screen share. We can see everyone's face. I think we have, I believe everyone's here. We might be missing a person. Dora, Jason, thank you very much for joining us and for joining us for so long. This was a rewarding and true learning experience for me. So finally, the students, in the worst of times, you guys really stepped up. I'm very proud of this work. You know, there was not even a weak project in the group. Every group was consistently amazing. So thank you very much for that. So with that,
Nice work, guys.
yes.
Yeah, congratulations, everyone. Fantastic. Thanks, Dwayne.
Nice work, Dwayne. Nice work, everyone.
Nice
Really,
work.
really impressive.
Congratulations.
So
I'll talk to Dwayne later and find out what was real and what wasn't, because I was kind of fooled. Maybe my screen was, but it was pretty incredible in terms of the, well, I mean, we're all sort of trying to figure out what these kind of perverse, you know, experiences on Zoom are. It's a little bit like, I don't know, there's no equivalent, but it's we're all struggling to figure out what these reviews are going to be like. And so I'm a little bit more optimistic after today. And I think it must have been really challenging for you guys to be working in teams and trying to put together these presentations in some manner. I know SCI-Arc is a school that is well known for its reviews and the physical nature of model making and all of the, you know, the things that go into that. So I'm sure this was challenging, but I think it was a pretty rich set of presentations, and I was excited. So you guys did amazing.
It was all real, Jason.
Doesn't even matter. As half of my ear got erased during, you know, you don't even know if I'm here. I might not be here. That was great.
Thank you. I'll talk to you all hopefully in person soon, but until then.
Take care.
See you guys soon.
Bye-bye.
Bye.